Colleagues, officers, good evening and welcome to anyone who is watching the live stream as well to Medway Council's Business Support Overview and Scrutiny Committee here at Gunwharf on the 24th of November. Welcome to everyone. May I particularly extend a welcome to Councillors Hazel Brown and Councillor Cooper, who are both substituting for colleagues this evening. And we have apologies from Phil Watts as well. That takes us to the formal apologies. I'd invite the two substitutes to clarify for whom they are substituting.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm substituting for Councillor Khan.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm substituting for Councillor Teresa Murray.
Okay, thank you very much. We have apologies from Councillor Etheridge, and for family reasons we have apologies for Councillor Rupert Turpin. They are not subbed. Okay, colleagues, that takes us on to the record of our meeting from October. Can I ask if everyone is content with the record as to accuracy? Okay, thank you. I will sign those during the meeting. Item 3, urgent matters. I'm not aware of any. Labour Group? No, we have no urgent items, thank you. Declarations, disclosable PIs or other interests. First of all, are there any interests to be declared? Councillor Curry.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got to, on item 6, as reference to the Urban Green Space volunteers. I'm the chair of the Urban Green Spaces Forum, and I will be mentioning something about that at that item. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Having scoured this agenda, on page 129 there is a one-line mention of my school, Rivermead, which I found. Am I Governor?
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor O'Para next, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a quick reference to the NEETs. Any mention of the NEETs, I do work extensively with NEETs within Medway here.
Thank you. Councillor Tijan.
Thank you, Chair. Just other significant interest. Agenda item 6 mentioned the Innovation Centre, the director of a company there, and agenda item 8 mentioned Kindy. I'm a director at Kindy.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? No? Okay. In terms of whipping, there is no Conservative group whipping. Councillor Maple? No Labour. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, that brings us on to our first substantive item, which is the procurement strategy through to 25. Agenda item 5. Mike Kelly is here, and Mike, I invite you to introduce the report and thank you for providing the written report.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening all. So the report this evening reflects on the progress against the procurement strategy, which was last presented here last November. It makes a recommendation to focus on contract and relationship management going into the year 2023, with special consideration to performance and finances as well. So that's the recommendation within the report, and I welcome any comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Councillor Maple, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks as always for the annual update. Very, very important to see. This is spending taxpayers' money, so we need to make sure that we're doing it in the most efficient and effective way possible. Just a couple of comments from me this year, really. One is around, I note kind of positively that for lots of the points within the strategy, we're at level 3, which means we have achieved. This is a 5-year plan, so I just want to get not picking on any particular one, but can you give the committee a sense of feeling as to how can we continue to feel assurance that that 3 hasn't slipped for whatever reason, just because we have a good relationship with third parties today. Actually, that's quite easily ruined if you upset them by going, stop doing that, or do more of that, or whatever it might be. So some assurance around that. It's right the way. I've got no problem with how it's laid out in the report we've got, but I think we just need to hear a little more around that. And to repeat a sentence I'm probably going to be saying quite a lot, regrettably, tonight, obviously, people will have companies, businesses, whether that's not-for-profits, private sector organisations, whoever, who've got contracts with us, will have huge challenges because of both inflation and, in particular, energy costs. So as a broad statement, because that ties into a number of aspects through the strategy, can you give us some confidence perhaps around the conversations that are currently being had with those who are providing services to Medway, and in particular what the course of action is from a procurement perspective? And I guess this is about management of the contract subsequently. If someone is coming to us saying, actually, inflation is meaning the price that we were given, we just simply can't deliver that because of the supply chain, or indeed equally if they've got those pressures with utility bills, which for some small and medium-sized enterprises is a huge chunk of our outlay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good evening, thank you. So in terms of the freeze not slipping, the information is supported behind the report, although not in there. So the report solely focuses on those actions from last year. I'm more than happy to retrospectively infill those and share those with the group if that's of importance as well, just to provide, and I think it's important to provide those levels of assurances to make sure that we haven't slipped on anything that we've assured the committee that we're delivering as well. So I'll take that back, so thank you for that point. In terms of assurances on contractors, we as a team don't contract manage, but we work with the services who do, for example. So we've got various literature on the internet and our service self pages in terms of how to contract manage and how that's performed, for example, and how to raise and remedy any issues that may arise. In terms of the impact of inflation, what we've noticed that our current contracts, whilst we're sure contractors are suffering, as I guess we all are in our personal lives to some degree as well, we don't have too many referrals from them. What we're seeing is the new contractors. So the new contracts bid in, the impact that's having on finances. There's been a couple of recent examples, for example, but how that's impacting and how we need to resolve those sort of matters as well. So we're proactively imagining what's coming forward, but we have an open door policy for any conversations with anything we have.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few comments I'd like to make, if I may. I'll run through them relatively quickly, and thank you very much for the report, which is really, really good, actually. Thank you. Just to start off on page 18, on the risk management table that's presented there, the risk is identified as reputational and a risk rating of D3. I'm curious as to why you've come to that conclusion. Obviously, procurement is a fundamentally important part of virtually everything we do as a council. And if we don't get it right, I would imagine the risk is a great deal higher than that, and it costs across a lot of things. So an explanation as to why you've simply made it a D3 reputational, as opposed to, if something goes wrong on procurement, it could be a B2 perhaps, or something like that. And I'd just like to know exactly how that works in terms of thinking through on that one. And then moving on to page 27 of the report. I wasn't aware of this, and this is new information to me. If I can just get to it, I'll be with you in a sec. And this is around the comments on the sort of control of contracts and the contract management not being fully understood by officers. I mean, something that local authorities have grown up with since I was an officer back in the olden days was that we were told we had to contract out services, and contract management was fundamental to being an officer back then. But apparently that's no longer the case, from what I understand from this. I am quite concerned, and as a matter of urgency, it should be dealt with, I think, certainly. And that's particularly true where we've got these long-running contracts, and I'm thinking particularly of a company like Norse, where we rely very heavily on their regular reports to us over the course of a year as to what they're up to, and from what I gather from this, we are simply trusting what they tell us on paper and not actually going out and doing proper inspection and contract monitoring work that used to be done when I was a younger person, if you like. And I am concerned, and I'd be interested to know how much we've become reliant upon written reports from contractors as opposed to actually going out to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing and they've done it to a standard that we require. And certainly in that respect, are we getting value for money? on that basis. So I've got a concern around that. It'd be interesting to hear. And I'm glad it's in here, and I'm glad it's being tackled. So it's not a problem, but I just raised that as an issue there. And just moving then on swiftly, if I may, Chair, to the page 31 of the report. And here we're dealing with the sort of social value side of things. It is brilliant that this is in here. I think this is really good work, and it's really exciting to see this is taken so seriously. And in that respect, it kind of fits in with our sustainable development targets, and the idea of UNICEF rights and respect and all that kind of stuff is coming into play in our thinking here. And to have the new staff sort of developing, having all staff having these principles built into our procurement. And what we're going to hopefully see, and this is something that goes into our sort of schools program, is that in all our schools, these kind of social values are being taught to the children. So as they grow up into the world of work and hopefully stay in Medway, and hopefully some of them become employed by Medway Council, they will see exactly what they've been learning at school coming up through the work of the council, which is very, very good to see. It'd be nice in that respect on objective 32 to see that linked more strongly to climate change. One of the issues around climate change is that it fits in very strongly in terms of things like air pollution with public health and safety and the provision of green spaces and such like, and also the issue of natural capital and how valuable our natural environment is in terms of its capital value to the community, if you like. And investment in our natural environment produces a lot of social benefits. So it'd be nice to see a stronger link in there in terms of sort of that side of the social value as well. And then sort of concluding really on my comments there, is this idea that we need to have that sort of triple bottom line built into everything we do: environment, economy, and the social community side of things. And that's good to see, but I'm asking probably a stronger emphasis on that if we can have it. But so it's really welcome, this report. One or two concerns, one or two issues there. Hopefully you can pick those up. Thank you very much, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll go through those in order. Let's start with the risk. So risk D3. So the risk is only relating to the procurement strategy itself, not procurement as a function. So this is simply about the adoption of the strategy and how its effectiveness will be deployed and the risk of not doing so. So I think whilst I would agree with your sentiments in terms of how important it is to get procurement right, the strategy supports that. So the risk itself is downplayed slightly in that respect. Although it's very important to get these aspects right, there's nothing written in law in terms of we have to be delivering these, for example. So that's the logic that sits behind that, although I welcome your comments in terms of why that's there. The contract management, and this is a very interesting one. Okay, so in terms of contract management, what we're doing through the adoption of the procurement strategy as well as wider stuff is a proportionate level of training for all officers responsible for their contracts. Now, I welcome and agree with your sentiment in terms of, an important part of contracts is the management itself. Okay, you need to be able to achieve and illustrate the benefits of what you set out to deliver. We need to achieve value for money that sits behind that. So I'm working with colleagues wider afield in terms of a training program that sits behind that, and also standardising the way in which we contract manage as an authority as well. So we have a wide breadth of services, different deliverables that sit underneath that, and proportionately and to proportionate the contract management that sits behind that. But contract management is a very important aspect in terms of moving forward, so we have a new baseline to develop and deliver further efficiencies on what we currently have at this point in time. As for social value, yeah, that was very well put actually, and that there's a link that currently exists that wasn't put within the report itself. So when we procure and when we apply social value, we've worked with other colleagues, specifically the climate change team, who have addressed specific deliverables within those. What I can do without outside this meeting and share wider is the social value that's been delivered through the Medway Council's projects over the past 12 months, and I think that'll give you a good indication of what social value looks like, what we've achieved for the local economy as well, and how we plan to better that going forwards as well. So climate change are an integral part of that decision-making process, and colleagues that we, as well as others, rely on when enforcing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for that. It's really helpful. I mean, in terms of the social value side of things, the 2012 Act asked us to consider it, but since then that's been strengthened, and it is now an actual requirement that we build it into everything we do. So it's really good to see that happening. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Just very quickly, in number 3 on page 21, you're talking about counsellor development programmes and training for counsellors. I just think I'd warmly emphasise the importance of that. Obviously, as your report says, it's too late in the cycle now, but I think looking back on my 2 terms as a counsellor, I think that's an element that's been missing that I would have benefited from, particularly with my responsibilities in the children's arena, because so much is commissioned. And, you know, I realise with a couple of recent incidents, one of which came to this committee, that I don't really understand the process, and I don't really understand what underlies it. So not necessarily for comment, but I just warmly recommend that those programmes next time round. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, and I welcome those. Actually, as part of, I've been working with colleagues in Democratic Services in terms of what a new training programme looks like and the deployment of that as well. So that's something I really want to get my teeth into and actually roll out across the board. So I welcome those comments.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Michael, for the report. I'm coming back to the risk on 4.1, this reputational risk, and it's probably my lack of understanding and knowledge around this. But as far as I can see, the real issue for us here is not the objectives within the strategy, but the strategy itself. And it says to periodically update and review the objectives and sharing the outcomes of the strategy. These are the mitigation actions, but the formal review of the strategy itself, I mean, I accept that the strategy was dropped in as the National Procurement Strategy, but actually the risks are Medway-wide sometimes, and we have specific things that are here because of the demographics and because of our proximity to London and various, you know, geographic issues as well. So I'm just wondering if actually we should have something that formally reviews the strategy, and we possibly have, and I've just missed it, and maybe it's audit that does it, maybe it's somewhere else, so maybe you can just tell me where.
Absolutely, and thank you. I think that point quite nicely comes back to Councillor Maples earlier as well, and in terms of baselining. So baselining was mentioned. So on previous iterations, and apologies it's not on this one, the objectives and descriptions and the score profiling that sat behind that was a lot more verbose than what we see today. The idea that sits behind the report coming every year to choose a strand of what to focus on is to address what would benefit Medway as an area as opposed to the strategy. So whilst the strategy is as an overarching guidance that we use, the recommendation today of looking at contract and relationship management focuses on what we need to do as a council as opposed to what nationally might be considered as a more as a priority. I hope that covers off that point.
Thanks. Yeah, it's, well, maybe actually I thought we were reviewing the strategy. We're actually reviewing a strand or some of it might be the title that threw me, sorry.
Okay.
Do you mind? Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So we have the National Procurement Strategy that we've self-reviewed against in terms of the objectives. We then localise them for how we want to better our own procurement function that sits within those. So we have taken the national strategy, but we've localised it to develop.
Okay, if any member has any comments in relation to matters which are carried forward or otherwise are labelled as to be addressed next year, please feel free to comment on those as are marked in that way on the appendix, because we will pass any comments forward to Cabinet. There may not be any comments, and we made one or two so far, but if there's anything else, please indicate. Councillor Curry.
Thank you, Chair. And just in that respect, then, it would be, it would be nice, if you like, I'm using the word nice in that respect. What's expressed in this document, as I say, is really welcome. And to see that in other aspects, certainly in terms of regeneration and selection of contracts for houses and stuff like that, other aspects of the council's work in housing provision particularly, I'm thinking, it'd be nice to see these principles applied across the board. Thank you.
Councillor Williams.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the exploring digital technology. As it says here, the finance and procurement systems are separate, and you are looking at going forward into amalgamating the two. I just wonder how far we got with that, because it says it's been removed from the strategy as this continues to be explored. Just can give us a little bit of update on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So what we have, so procurement has its own e-procurement system. Finance will have their own finance management system, for example. What we've tried to explore previously is any synergies that can happen between the systems. Unfortunately, the term of the contracts haven't been coterminous, for example, although we further consider how we can integrate those systems. So they're relatively primitive, being honest with you. I mean, our finance management system has a known term which we can create around our system, but it's work to be.
Did the two contracts run out at the same time for the two, the procurement and the finance?
No, so our e-procurement system runs out next year. The finance management system has got several years left on its term.
Thank you. I'll come to the Vice Chair, Councillor Tijan.
Thank you, Chair. It is moved that the committee has noted the achievement of the second year of the 2021 and 2025 procurement strategy as outlined in Appendix 1 with updated comments. It is also moved that the committee has considered the delivery of the objectives marked for carry forward in Appendix 1 and refers any comments to Cabinet.
Okay, just to clarify that Mr. Platt has captured members' comments in that respect. Is that seconded, please? Councillor Clark. Okay, can I see those in favour? Thank you. Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, very much. Thank you. Colleagues, that brings us on to our next item 6. We're looking at performance monitoring for a Q2 of the financial year. And Kate, Sam, sorry, Sam. Sam is going to introduce and take questions on that. Sam.
Thank you, Chair. The report summarises the performance for the council plan measures of Q2. There are 7 council plan measures of success which fall under the remit of this committee, and they're presented in Appendix 1. 5 measures fall under the growth priority and 2 measures fall under the council values. We're reporting 6 out of the 7 council plan measures having met or exceeded target, with the exception of the MAE2, which is the percentage retention rate at the Medway adult education. The target there is 94%, and this is slightly below at just under 90%. This is less than 5% and therefore has been rated amber. Given the committee's overarching responsibilities, this report also contains the performance summary for all services as detailed in Appendix 2. The report also presents the Q2 review of strategic risks, which can be found in Appendix 3, and there are no changes to the strategic risks or the current scores for this quarter. However, ahead of the new risk framework that we will be introducing for next year, of which we're gathering feedback from members and officers on, the Chief Operating Officer has proposed that strategic risks are split into live risks and managed risks, which will help them, members of this committee as well as corporate management team, focus on those that are within our remit. And finally, just to remind you, this was reviewed at Cabinet on the 15th of November. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Councillor Maple, please.
Thank you very much for the update, Sam. Just 2 or 3 bits on this, really. One is around looking specifically at the income reduction risk, which is SR49. Obviously, that talks very specifically about income reduction as a result of COVID. you know, it's right that that risk has been reduced, of course, from where we were a year, 18 months, 2 years ago. But I wonder whether there's any thoughts now on whether that should change to a general income reduction risk, because I suspect actually the cost of living will now have more of an impact on our incomes reducing as a council than COVID. And there is a small risk at some point that actually over the next 12 months, and I hope this doesn't happen, but there is a risk that actually COVID has a bit of a spike again. And actually we may have the financial double hit of both income reduction because of cost of living and COVID. So I wonder whether there have been any thoughts around that. Other colleagues may pick up on other things. The other thing I wanted to raise was around performance monitoring report HC4, and that's very specifically on the issue of number of private sector properties improved as a result of the council's intervention. Mark Brethwick gave some very helpful answers at the Health and Wellbeing Board, which was held on the day that a couple of days after that tragic situation with the coroner's report in Rochdale. So I just wondered, appreciating entirely that actually Rochdale was a registered social landlord, and we have a mixture of properties here in Medway in the rental sector, a number of which in the private sector, which are not fit for purpose as far as I am concerned. And I know I've received certainly emails to that effect, including on the issue of mould this week. But also we've got a number of registered social landlords which probably operate more diversity in our community than perhaps is helpful. You know, we've got well over a dozen, whereas actually if we just had 2 or 3 operating here, that would probably be helpful for communication. And we have ourselves as a landlord as well, probably the biggest single landlord in the former Gillingham Borough Council area for sure, and MHS as well, which is a strange hybrid of all of those things. So I wonder, Mark, whether you've got some commentary around giving us as elected members that confidence that this council is doing and will continue to do all it can to make sure we don't have a coroner's report like we've seen in Rochdale, because actually I would say more from a private sector housing situation in Medway, it could have been here. It could have been here. So I know you gave some initial thoughts on that, like I say, Health and Wellbeing Board, so anything you want to amplify or expand on that as well would be helpful. Thank you.
Katie will comment on the first aspect.
Thank you, Chair. I think all your observations are absolutely right. We keep an eye on this risk quarterly. I think that elsewhere on the agenda tonight there's the revenue monitoring, which talks about some impacts of parking, continuous changes in behaviour. On the flip side, we're seeing income in our leisure services, for instance, is holding up really, really well, better than we actually expected. So I think what I'd say is that we've got round 3 monitoring happening at the moment. The results will be coming to Cabinet in January, and I think we might take a view on that as to what we need to do in terms of making some projections for income moving forward. But it might be as simple as taking the COVID-19 reference out of that risk and updating it, but I'll take that back. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Maple, for your point. So, I mean, this case is incredibly tragic and is a real watershed moment, I think, for all landlords, irrespective of tenure, and everyone across the board needs to, well, up their game where they need to, but continue to deliver high quality accommodation to ensure that this doesn't happen anywhere else. Now, obviously, I have more direct control over our social stock. So, if I talk for a second about what the things that we are doing there, so we've been through a restructure of our housing service, a positive one that grew resources, that have brought in new posts into the housing revenue account that focus on our relationship with tenants, which is incredibly important in this type of situation, but also provides more of a focus around property condition and compliance. Now that includes a resident liaison, who is just someone that is who is employed to talk to residents, to look at complaints, to deal with issues between us, any that residents might have with their contractor, but essentially to foster a very good relationship between landlord and tenant. We have a stock condition surveyor, which is a function that can go around and check the condition of properties and pick up issues out on estates on a rolling basis. Part of that remit was also to ring round to all tenants over the course of a year and ask them questions specifically about damp and mould to see whether there are any issues that we're having. We've also reviewed our damp and mould policy that's very much structured towards property condition, essentially. So, it's very clear that these issues cannot just be resigned to lifestyle issues and pushed back to the tenant. There are underlying issues with properties that need to be addressed to allow someone to live in their property without those challenges. There is an important part around working with tenants to help them understand how to manage their property in the best way, and that will continue to be important, particularly as we make them more airtight and more energy efficient. The ventilation becomes absolutely key in reducing condensation, certainly. So those are some things we're doing in the social sector. One thing I would say as well is we're embarking on a program of energy efficiency works. Our stock performs relatively well already. There is work for us to do. We recently submitted a bid to I think it's to Bays to do £1.7 million worth of work to council homes to improve energy efficiency, and there'll be more to follow after that. So it's something we need to continue to try and get right. I'm not saying entirely that there isn't work for us to do, but it's important that we foster a positive relationship with tenants, and we're dealing with these, with issues when they arise. Preventative maintenance is also really important. Getting out to properties and making sure gutters aren't leaking, where there might be issues with roofs that we are addressing those. What I would propose we do going forwards is that we report more directly on to this committee in terms of our narrative around some of our indicators, to specifically highlight this issue and talk very openly and transparently about the complaints the local authority is getting. So that's social stock, and then I'll touch on private stock. Sorry, it is a bit of a ramble. So we know that there is a damp and mould issue in the private sector. You'll see in the reporting from this quarter that it's one of our top category 1 hazards. That is partly due to condition, partly it's an inherent issue within the stock and in our private stock and the age of some of those properties. We'll take enforcement action where we can. Obviously, the Enforcement Concordat asks that we work with private landlords wherever possible, but we are over recent years certainly we've increased the tools in the box that we have available to take enforcement action against private landlords. We will need to look at that function essentially. So that team has a big focus, including as well as damp and mould complaints. It will be HMO licensing and enforcement issues there. It will also be caravan park licensing and a range of other issues. And it may be that I do need to refocus that team, to look more at damp and mould on a proactive basis, which I would love to do. I think in an ideal world, I could probably have about 15 more staff that were out there, poking around in the private sector and finding issues to enforce against. I don't think we're going to get to that position, so I will need to prioritise what that team looking at, and it would be difficult to argue that this one isn't a priority.
Thank you. Thank you for both of those answers. Just on the finance first, I think that's a logical step to say actually, decreasing revenue for whatever the reason is a risk. I agree. On this, Mark, that's a really comprehensive answer, and I know people will be looking on tonight and will be given some comfort from that. As I think I've said previously, and at Health and Wellbeing Board, I think the risk in Medway is far more the private sector than the social sector. That's not to say every social landlord is absolutely doing their job. And of course, the final challenge actually is around some of the practical issues. So because of the cost of living, actually people will be keeping their windows shut more. And actually one of the things that really makes mould grow at a real escalated rate is lack of ventilation. So because of no one's fault, actually, there's a risk of it being worse than ever this winter because of the very conditions we find ourselves in. So look, and would really welcome that increased focus on that reporting moving forward. It's a topic which I think every councillor probably across Medway have had issues with residents, some more than others because of the housing stock in their ward, but that's a really helpful response, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Councillor Curry, please.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, that's a very comprehensive reply, so most of my comments around that issue have been covered. Just one other thing I would like to ask about, and it really doesn't help when the Prime Minister says everyone should turn their heating down, when the people on low incomes are already doing that, but there you go. But it's about insulation and how we're doing with insulation. So there's just a question around that. And then just quickly, Chair, if I may, I'll move on to page 80 of the report, and that's on green spaces. And there we've got this satisfaction survey information. I've commented on this before, and it's in the green. And I'm confused as to how those figures are gathered. I think I have mentioned this at a previous meeting. Because if you go and look at somewhere like Town Hall Gardens, or you go up to Hillyfields, where there's a lot of problems with the graffiti, clearly there's not a satisfaction there at all. The parks are in a poor state of repair, a number of them, and even some of our green flags may be questionable now, and they're being surveyed by the green flag committees at the moment. So we've got some problems about where this data is coming from that says everything's hunky-dory in the green, and I am quite concerned about that. Just moving on to that as well, where it talks about the satisfaction with refuse collection, W6CP, just at the top of the next page, and there we've got this green again, and we know that the recycling rates are dropping. They're now below 50% for recycling. So whatever the refuse collection citizen panel results tell us, things are not green. Our refuse collection is failing when it comes to things like recycling and climate change. So I really would like to see some different representation there that's much more accurate. And then in that respect, just to bring the committee's attention to page 83 regarding the Friends Group's information there. Just to point out, and again, this information was on the last report we had. Council has 18 formally constituted Friends Groups. It's got 15 groups, actually. That information is not accurate. And it says there are more Friends Groups are to be added during 2022. That was the hope, but it never happened because the Green Spaces team don't have enough staff. So that information, again, on this report is not accurate. And it makes me a little bit concerned about the rest of the report and the actual accuracy of all the information in here, because we do really need to be, we as a committee need to know exactly what's going on. Otherwise, we can't make sound judgments and have sound discussions unless we know that what we're being told in these reports is accurate. So it really is quite an important point that what we're given in these reports is actually matching up. Because seeing these green buttons all being pressed when actually underneath there, the underlying information, it's not right and things aren't quite right, is a concern that I have. So I just brought that to the committee's attention. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, so I'll just pick up the point on insulation, if that's okay. So in the housing revenue account, we have a roof replacement programme, and at any time that we do a roof, we will replace it with 300, or we will replace or top up the insulation in the loft to 350 mils, which is the standard. We've done previous programmes of topping up loft insulation where we haven't done the roof, and we've done programmes of cavity wall insulation. In terms of our direction going forward, so insulation is picked up in our social housing decarbonisation fund bid. So I've desperately been looking for the specific number, but I've been able to find it before I was able to answer the question. So there will be properties that have more insulation done. And as well as other improvements to improve air tightness and those types of things. So insulation in council stock is reasonable. We have very, very good EPC data now, so we've had a real push on getting as much data as we can in relation to our property. So we've got really good visibility across 100% of our stock now, which is, you know, you'd struggle to find that in most other landlords, which gives us a really clear idea as to where we need to make interventions, and that will be built into bids or programmes of work going forward so that everyone's got the right level of insulation. In terms of the private sector, I would probably need to come back to you with some more specific numbers, if that's okay, Councillor Curry. So we don't have visibility of everything, but we have employed a new post this year that is a sustainable warmth officer, which is purely focused at looking at the private sector and owned properties. they're working with the Southeast Energy Hub to deliver. There's lots of acronyms in this, but various energy funding pots essentially to do insulation to properties in the private sector, and I can get you some numbers on that to let you know how that's going.
Sam.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Curry. The briefing around the citizen panel is due in December, so I do apologise for the delay, but the team are working on that to detail where that data is coming from and how it's gathered, so that will be made available in December, and again, apologies for the delay. In terms of the general feedback on perhaps some of the issues in here not seeming to be right, I will take away the Friends Group action. I'm not close enough to the detail to either confirm or not. But I did want to also add that at the moment we are reviewing how we manage performance, and we are looking at the system we use. So we use a system called Pentine, and we have a number of authors who are commissioned to put detail into the system, which the team extract out. And one of the things we want to do is be better with our narrative, not necessarily just reflect on what we've been up to, but actually what we are going to do moving forward against the target. So we've got a number of training courses that are being rolled out to the authors who are doing this in preparation for next year in terms of the refresh of the council plan and the performance measures. So apologies if this isn't accurate, but we are aware that we do have some narrative issues that we do need to fix.
Councillor Johnson, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sam and Mark, for the report and discussion. The issue about narrative and looking forward, I think, has been addressed. The adult ed underperformance, slight underperformance, includes in the narrative what steps are going to be taken, so a wider variety of starting times and those sorts of issues. My guess is that learners enrolled on the ESOL courses are probably most vulnerable to changing work patterns at short notice, those sorts of things. So that's really positive to see. Can I note in passing that there are no children in B&B and no children over 6 weeks in B&B? That's, I think, something worth celebrating. So well done to housing on that. There's been quite a long discussion about the housing hazards, particularly in the private sector. So I absolutely reiterate what's been said already and welcome Mark's response. The one thing I would add is, in response to reading the report here, in terms of the risk, it mentions, I think, as you used the terms about grade 1 hazards and grade 2 hazards. So on that basis, I looked on the website to see if there was some sort of private sector enforcement policy where I could sort of read what the hazards were and how they were graded. I couldn't find a policy. I could find a record of decisions which went back to 2010. Now, that's almost certainly an issue to do with me and the website. But I would be interested to know whether we have something that we as councillors could read that would, make those issues clearer for us. There does seem to be a bit of a spike in mould and damp for obvious reasons. But actually, you mentioned about electrical hazards as well. Being an issue. So if there is such a document, my guess is there will be something. And you mentioned revising the damp and mould policies. So, if those are available to us to have a look at, I'd welcome that. Yeah. And just finally, not particularly for this committee, except it's for the council as a whole, on page 58, the percentage of social worker posts that are not held by a permanent social worker is 32%. We, in this committee and across the council, need to realise, as I've said at this committee before, and as we've said a lot at Children's Committee, that is a real threat to the children's services improvement, that there are 1/3 of social worker posts are not filled by permanent social workers. There are a wide variety of reasons for that. We at Children's have discussed that at some length and on a number of occasions. We had a report from Sam and the HR team about recruitment, but it really is very important that we recognise what a threat that is to continued improvement, given that we are only months away from what is likely to be the final ILACS inspection. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Who's going to respond? Mark.
Just to, on the point you mentioned around the licensing policy, so I will check that, if that's okay, just to make sure it is on the right document is on the website. There is literature that details the hazards. I'd be more than happy as well to provide any informational training, or it talks a bit more about those. It is a complicated formula that we end up at the various hazard ratings, but I can certainly provide some information on that, so I'll make sure everything's in the right place. Damp and mould policy specifically related to housing revenue account stock, so our council stock. Everything else in the private sector is picked up under the enforcement and licensing policy. I'm happy to share both of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brown, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, I'm afraid it's back to you again. This doesn't actually feature necessarily in the report, but I'm very happy to see the kind of support work that housing officers are doing and other officers within the housing department to support vulnerable families. But also my question really is about, and I know that there's no direct responsibility for your guys to do this, but is there any opportunities being made available, or are they working cross-party with supported housing providers? Because the problem we have in London, and I do work in this sector, is that with the costs going up, the amount of money that the supported housing sector is being given from commissioners means that a lot of their staff may be not as aware of the hazards. So I'm just wondering if there's opportunities to work with supported housing providers to make them aware of the hazards, not necessarily whether they're ones or twos, but things like mould, so that they can advise their people how to better ventilate bathrooms and stuff after they've used them and stuff like that.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. So I think things probably happen indirectly. I don't think there's anything specifically targeted. So if there is a supported housing provider where we had a complaint about the accommodation, for example, we would go there and we would issue advice and we would take action against the landlord if we thought it was needed. I do think there's probably a good point there that we can probably have a more structured conversation with our own supported accommodation providers, or whether it be supported. I know there's lots of different names, whether it's supported living or supported housing, or I think there's probably a bit more work that we can do there. So I'll take that away and look to see whether there's anything we can cascade out across any of our commissioning bodies that can pass that on to their providers.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, going back to this terrible tragedy with this young boy, it was really awful, really awful. And interestingly, I've watched an adjournment debate on this in the Commons this afternoon, where the MP for Rochdale actually stood up and, gave a eulogy about, what was happening. And this particular board, I think, are going to be fined for what has happened to this young boy. It's really awful, and I feel very sorry for the parents. So hopefully things will get done nationally as well as locally. Going back to our agenda, I wonder if I might ask a question on page 53. I'm not sure whether I'm doing the right thing. It's the report with reference to support people and vulnerable families to access housing. And the paragraph there, the very last line, it says the service is funded through the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and we are waiting to hear about ongoing funding. Now, I know there's been a lot of changes with ministers and secretaries of state in the government. Just wondering when we are liable to be, or likely to be getting this funding, which I think we desperately need. And another housing issue, several hazards have been mentioned, and there's a one-line reference fire. Now, just recently, as Mark Brethwaite will know, we've had a tragic fire in my own ward, and going on from what Councillor Brown has said about, asking people to beware, I think that, making sure that people know about fire hazards is going to be something really crucial, because there have been a couple of fires in my ward just recently, and some of the residents there, unfortunately, they do things within their own home which causes a fire, which they might not think will cause a fire, but does. So I think that something to be done about that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. So there are two key streams of, well, there are lots of key streams of funding that we're dependent on the government for. The two that are specifically mentioned in this report, one is the rough sleeping initiative, and I'm pleased to confirm, I think at the time that the update was written, which was obviously a little while ago now, that the funding settlement was embargoed, but I can confirm on that we received funding for this year, and we'll be receiving funding for next year and the year after that. So it will take us up to 2025 in terms of our rough sleeper funding. One area, the other area is domestic abuse funding, and that hasn't been confirmed beyond this year. So that's where we are on those particular funding issues. We'll continue to lobby the government essentially to make sure that we receive a similar level of funding as we've received this year. In respect to fire, I completely agree. So I've dealt with several fire-related incidents in the last month. I'm not sure what's happened. I think the good thing that I can say is that each of those fires have been contained, and the fire-stopping measures that we put in place on those individual properties have worked essentially. So that's a really positive thing. But there is a bit in this about raising awareness and education. There've been a range of different reasons as to why those fires have started. There's not one. We haven't got cookers and things that are failing. There've been a range of things that have largely been outside of the council's control, relating to batteries that have been charging on worktops, and we've had an incident of arson, and we've had a chip pan fire essentially. The concerning thing for me is in where we've put in fire stopping measures, particularly in blocks, and where we specifically need to raise awareness are on things like belongings that are stored in communal areas, which is an ongoing issue for any landlord in any bit of the country. That is a war of attrition to get that, to really turn the tide on that. The other is just use of the fire stopping measures that we put in place. So I visited a property where the fire door that we put on in the kitchen was propped open with a bag, and that's something we need to just work with tenants to help them understand why those measures are there and how they are to be used to make sure they do their job in the instant of a fire. So that's a very long way of me saying I completely agree, and a fire awareness campaign is something that we will do.
I'm going to, in a moment, call Councillor O'Para, but I wonder if I could just ask from the chair, Mark, in terms of the danger, and Councillor Cooper alluded to it, in terms of fire, people who, contrary to the rules and regs, store in communal areas, in communal cupboards, even paint. Yeah. I mean, what are the powers of landlords generally, and what are our powers in terms of our stock in the former Gillingham Borough for simply removing? What notice is required? What's our legal position? Thanks.
So our legal position is that in the first instance we're to address those issues with the tenant. So we have a programme of officers visiting communal areas, and essentially they will sticker items to say this needs to be removed within X amount of time, otherwise we will remove it. If the item is still there, we will remove it. We have an obligation to store it for a period of time, see if anyone claims it. If not, we will dispose of it. But it is a challenge. I think every block that I've been to has had elements of, even when someone's been relatively recently and cleared out, what's been in the stairwells, you go back the next week and things are there. The thing that we need to think about really is why, the challenge for me, I think, as the head of housing is, well, why are people storing? What is the issue that's driving that? So fundamentally, it's driven by a lack of storage that people have got in their flats because they're not that generous in terms of their space. So we need to work constructively again with tenants, and whether we have particularly acute issues to say, well, how can we provide storage in a different way? And other landlords have done that with lockable boxes that are situated outside the flat, or with sheds that are in a communal garden. So I think there's the enforcement piece that we need to carry on doing, but there is also the working with tenants to understand, well, what drives that issue and what can we do to improve that.
Thanks very much. Councillor O'Para, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, on the all children achieving their potential in education, 25% of our children, well, of that rating is actually still red. And obviously our children, primary school children especially, those with reading and writing and mathematics, we're is read, and the percentage of children who were persistently absent also from school being read. Noting also that there are schools that are inadequate. I wonder what's being done to ensure that our children, every child here in Medway, actually achieves an education and we're able to raise aspiration and ambition, because that's right.
Yeah, is there a page reference?
Yes. All right. 72.
72. Thank you. Who is able to comment? Sam?
I wouldn't necessarily say I could comment on this, but I know it's certainly something that has been debated at the other scrutiny committees, and there will be notes that would follow. So I can take it away and get the latest position from the Director of Education and the Assistant Director, but I wouldn't be best placed to comment on that today.
That's fine. We've got our children, children and young people, so I'll bring it up then. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Williams.
Yeah, thanks for the report. Actually, all the questions I was going to ask have been asked by colleagues. I'd just like to say it's good to see the housing team are still working with tenants and landlords to improve the standard of accommodation, and that 278 private sector households have been assisted, and also that where necessary in using enforcement. I just want to reiterate what Councillor Johnson said about the categories. If we could have a briefing note or a link to something that give us explain the category, I think it'd be quite handy for us councillors if we have to go to a house we asked by a resident and that. But that would be really good. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Tijan.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one for you, Mark. During this time, Internet of Things, I know there's at least one council currently using smart technology to detect mold and damp and inform them. Have we given any consideration to that in terms of your policy that you'll be developing?
Yes, absolutely. So we are working, so we already do some things that we call data loggers. They're quite a basic device. There has obviously been advancements in the technology, so we met with a company that I won't name for the moment because we haven't made any decisions yet, to look at a device that measures things like temperature, it measures heat loss, it measures humidity, it can do kind of two-way communication. So it's something that I'm really keen on and I think will be a real benefit for us in terms of managing these issues going forward. So I'm absolutely confident that we will take something forwards that gives us a better technological option around monitoring the condition of properties. So yeah, absolutely.
Are you looking to take this forward just in regards to the council stock or across the board in terms of all landlord?
At the moment, just for council stock, I'm not sure, or I'd need to give some thought, I think, to the operational challenges of getting devices into other private properties and how we'd sustain that on an ongoing basis. So there's no plans around the private sector, and it's important to remember that the obligation around property condition sits with the private landlord, but for council stock, we will do something.
Social landlord? Social housing?
Again, down to the individual landlord. What I can say is that there is across Kent, there is it's got a very dull title, but it's an asset management group essentially, but it looks at things like planned works, it looks at damp, we've looked specifically at damp and mould, and there is currently an appetite from most landlords that I've spoken to about getting devices that go into tenants' properties. I mean, it would probably be a benefit to the committee if I spoke to some of our larger social landlords to find out what their plans are, and then I can perhaps report back on that separately.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, for raising a wide variety of very good points and questions there. I'll come to the Vice Chair, page 44, recommendations.
Thank you, Chair. I move that the members of this committee have considered the Q2 2022-2023 performance against the measures used to monitor progress against the Council's priorities and have noted the amended strategic risk summary as set out in Appendix 3, and that members have noted the classification of risk as lived or managed as set out in section 2.7 and 2.8.
Thank you. Is that seconded? Councillor Clark, could I see members in favour, please? Okay, and we are unanimous in that. Thank you very much, colleagues. That brings us on to, again, Sam's next report in relation to the interesting topic of risk registers and the summary, agenda item 7. Sam, please.
Thank you, Chair. At the Business Support Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 25th of August, members requested sight of the Directorate risk summaries. This report presents Q2 BSD risk summaries as requested, and they can be found in Appendix 1. Please note further risks are captured on service plan and projects, therefore you only have the Directorate level risks and they're summarised for you today.
Councillor Maple.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to go back to the previous item and just say, for the avoidance of doubt, an asset management group is never boring. It's a great thing, wherever it is. There you go. Can I thank officers for bringing this forward, and can I thank my friend and colleague, Councillor Clive Johnson, who, along with Councillor Etheridge, have been at the forefront of asking for this information to come forward. I've been a councillor 15 and a half years, and I think we've always taken at face value the simple sentence of, oh, it's not on the corporate risk register because it's on the department risk register, and we've gone, okay, and then we've just moved on. And I think collectively we've gone, well, we probably just need to have a little look at that. And I think tonight shows that this is a good thing to do. And certainly I'll be wholeheartedly supporting the second recommendation that the Vice Chair will move later, no doubt, because actually it's good for the other committees to have a look at theirs as well. They'll be quite different, I'm sure, and that's fine, actually. The 4 different scrutiny committees cover, obviously by the nature of it, different areas, and actually even the way those risks are measured and looked at will be appropriate to take that approach. So it's good that we can have that more detailed conversation. I wanted to pick up a couple of items, and this is part of the reason we did this rather than all of them coming here, is so that those 4 committees can actually have a bit of debate about some of the things that are on here. So I want to quickly firstly look at BSD 02, which is the externally hosted systems. And at a time when cybersecurity continues to be something, even as leader of the opposition, that keeps me up at night, because if this goes wrong, it really goes wrong. I wanted to get a bit of a further understanding, because it's not explicitly covered in here, whether the councils, you know, the services that are hosted by somebody else for us, whether they're confident that their firewalls, protections, etc., are at the point where it's not putting us as a council at risk, because finance and revs and bens are pretty important systems. So to fear that they have not got the same level of robustness that we have as a local authority, and we know, sadly, that sometimes even for local authorities, it can go wrong. Those hackers are pretty intelligent people. So we need to be as intelligent as them. So the fact that somebody else is hosting this for us, colleagues might go, that's absolutely fine. It's a well-known company, I note, with interest. So I'd be interested to hear a response on that. The other one, which I just want you to just, and I know the answer to this will be yes, I'm sure, not least because I think we raised a similar question back in the summer, and that's on the homelessness risk. And thanks, regrettably, to the climate emergency, we saw this year, and I suspect we will see in future years, actually the very final bullet point around tackling cold weather. And I've got no doubt that Mark and his team, working with, in particular, organisations from the not-for-profit sector, will do everything they can to support Medway's homeless community over the next few weeks and months. However, we had similar problems but of the complete opposite nature in July and August this year. So I wanted to get a sense of feeling as to whether through time, and certainly I would hope within the next 18 to 24 months, because some of the strategy will be exactly the same, some will be different by the nature of it. I think we need to change this for adverse weather provision eventually, but I recognise that's easy to say, and actually if you're creating a new bit of policy from scratch, that will be more difficult to do. And then finally, I just want to understand why the legal division isn't on here, because actually they've got some questions I'd quite like to understand. They are one of the bits of this system, not the only bit, within this departmental division that obviously is co-located predominantly. Actually, some of their services are over in Gravesham, some remain here, and I think because of the nature of that being more customer facing than perhaps some of the other shared services, I'd be interested to see how that's managed within the departmental risk register as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, okay. Katie's going to come in first.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, just so that risk around externally hosted systems, those two systems are both mine, effectively. So it probably makes sense that I talk to this one. So I think we drafted this risk more from a point of view of recognising that where our own in-house IT systems are responsible for keeping our data and systems safe and up and accessible, that obviously there are many advantages to outsourcing, or not outsourcing, but to I don't know what the word is. Yes, to share, to externally hosting. There we go. Our data. There are also risks around. Will we be able to access it all the time? And obviously then we revert to sort of contractual issues. I think if Mike was still here, he would talk at length about the sort of, at length sounds rude, he would talk about our that's not what I meant, that our kind of procurement process for software systems is drafted in such a way that we make sure that we're really clear that where we're allowing another organisation to process or host our data, that they are subject to exactly the same sort of rigorous standards. I know that our policies say that we won't host outside of the EU, for instance, because we're all governed by GDPR still. And I think the other thing I'll probably say about that is just that one of the actions in that particular risk talks about DDAT strategy. So I'm going to butcher is it digital data and technology, I think. So I think up until that strategy existed, we didn't really have a kind of clear policy on whether it's better to have our data locally hosted or whether it's better to have that data externally hosted. And that DDAT strategy doesn't say one way or the other, but what it does give us is a really clear set of common principles that all officers who are negotiating or letting new contracts or making decisions about how that data is going to be hosted will be able to follow, so that we will be much sort of more consistent in our decision making. And a big part of that is about understanding that risk. And just a few bits on sort of our general sort of cybersecurity stuff. So Sam and I are both well aware, because we spend a lot of time with Paul, who's our Chief Information Officer, about just sort of how robust our arrangements are. So we do sort of regular scans of our, they're called PSN compliance, and I can't remember what PSN stands for, sorry, but we do sort of regular vulnerability scans, and they take learning on from that, and they're constantly kind of looking to what's happening elsewhere and monitoring the level of risk, and all of that really positive work just to make sure that our data is safe. So yeah, I think I'm not concerned actually about our data being hosted with the two particular systems that we are. So our main financial management system and our core revenues and benefits system, neither are presenting us with any issues in terms of data access. We've got absolutely no concern about their the robustness of their arrangements to safeguard that data either. So I think there's just that point about identifying that something could be a risk is not the same as saying that we think that's manifesting here. And I think just good practice for us to record that here. Hope that helps. Thanks.
Okay. Andy, I think next.
Yeah, thank you. So just whilst I fully appreciate the risk talks about cold weather provision, which has been our challenge, but is likely to switch towards excessive heat in the future, that's just something we probably need to update in all honesty. What I can assure the committee of is that we during the period of very hot weather during the summer, we did activate our severe weather protocol, and it's severe weather as opposed to just cold weather, and we were placing people into accommodation, both eligible people and people that didn't have recourse to public funds who might not necessarily usually get a service from somewhere else. So in practice, we are considering all forms of severe weather.
Councillor Curry, I think.
So, sorry, Chair. Firstly, to say those are two really helpful answers, so thank you very much. I know we've still got longer term. The briefing on cybersecurity is pending at some point, I think. But just on the point that legal is not included, that would be helpful.
Sorry, Sam and I have both had conversations with Bipinda around this. So I think he's currently reviewing the service plans that sit below that. So the FBI had drafted our risk register as a divisional risk register on the basis of this request. I think I'm right in saying that what Bipinda has is a suite of individual service risk registers, and rather than just necessarily all of those needing to be on that divisional, I can't say the word now, register, they're taking some time to just think about which of those need to be reflected on that next level up, and that will join in the next quarter.
Okay, and perhaps that information could be fed into us. Okay, fine. Councillor Curry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for this really helpful report. I mean, like Councillor Maple, I think this is a very valuable addition to the work we're doing, and I would certainly like to see it at Regen, which is the other committee, so I'll be supporting that motion. Just very specifically in relation to BSD 10, in terms of the capital programme and impact there. You've got the columns talked about what you do if there were risks and stuff like that, particularly right now, which we're facing that issue as we speak. And then you talk in the proposed further controls column about the cessation of non-essential spend. And it'd be interesting to see how that's defined, because there are spends happening within the council to which some members are not happy, and other spends where perhaps we should be looking at as more essential than others. And as it's in there, it'd be nice to know exactly what you mean by the cessation of non-essential spends, and perhaps that's something that this committee needs to debate as to how we define that. I don't know, but that's my only point. My other point was on the homelessness, which has been dealt with. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Katie.
Thank you. So I think this might partly be a sort of an artefact of the fact that we wrote this as an internal divisional document. And so if you identify risk and you review, you consider that risk is not tolerable at the level that it's currently at, you reflect on the controls that or the inherent risk is not tolerable. You reflect on the controls that you've already got in place, which are in that third column. But because we aren't necessarily happy with leaving a risk at a B2 score, we need to think about what further opportunities there might be to manage that risk down. And so that last column is very little more than my thinking as CFO as to what action might possibly be taken. And I think what I was indicating there is if we've got a particular scheme where some elements of the spend are not absolutely fundamental to the delivery of that overarching scheme. For instance, I don't know if we've got a tolerance built into a communications budget for something. What I'm certainly not indicating there is that I believe that we've got any right to challenge the deliverability of a scheme that's received full council approval. So I think we're really talking about tinkering in the margins, and the point below is talking much more about if there are particular peaks. You know, if the OBR thought, or Bank of England thought that base rate was going to soar for 3 months, it might be sensible for us to see if there are opportunities to take the foot off the gas for a very short period and then commence the borrowing again after that point. So I think it's really just a sort of an opportunistic approach rather than seeking to actually impact on the deliverability of the capital programme, because as I say, that's already been approved by full council. So certainly not my place to do.
Okay, if I may just quickly follow up, in that respect then, if you do identify those tweaks and stuff like that, is that something that you would recommend, put forward as a recommendation to, say, Cabinet or something like that, or to the portfolio holder to take forward? Is that how it would work?
I think if I may, that's probably, because of the scale at which we're likely talking, I think that's something that we would be talking to project managers about, and I would expect to see reflected in capital budget monitoring. So, for instance, you do see there are occasionally underspends on our capital scheme where we've essentially overestimated the cost of delivering something. I think we'll probably be seeing fewer of those moving forward as times are really tough. But I think that's the kind of route I would envisage seeing if we saw something that we thought might be stoppable. But I actually think in the current climate, all of our officers are thinking about that anyway and being really careful about how we spend public money and making sure that we sweat every pound to deliver the objectives that we've agreed to.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, welcome sight of this. In this particular instance, it provides that surety that issues that are dealt with within the Children's Directorate are addressed across the councils. One of the key issues out of the ILACs was whole council leadership on improvement. So I welcome seeing BSD 07, capacity of HR to support CNA. So that gives us some assurance that is being met. And then we're then able to analyse that at greater length. We're able to scrutinise it should we need to. So it is a very welcome addition, I think. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Councillor Brown.
Actually, my question's been answered, thank you.
Fine, thank you, colleagues. Then I'll come to the Vice Chair. Just before I do, is there a consensus amongst members with respect to the recommendation that other ONS committees consider as well? Yeah, okay. So on that basis, I'll ask the Vice Chair to put forward 5.1 and 5.2. Thank you. Councillor Tijan.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move the recommendation on page 116 that members have noted the Business Support Directory Register summary as shown in Appendix 1. And members have also recommended to the other, or recommends to the other Overview and Scrutiny Committee that they have sight of the directory and summaries as outlined in section 2.2 and 2.3.
Okay, we move on to items 8 and 9, which are our budget monitoring round 2 of the present municipal financial year, respectively capital and revenue. For capital, we welcome back Andy McNally-Johnson, and for revenue, we welcome back Dave Reynolds. And we'll start, Andy, if we may, with capital. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. So this report represents the second round of budget monitoring process for our capital programme, which now stands at £472 million. The overall position reported to Cabinet on the 15th of November was an overspend of £666,000, primarily arising from the expansion of the 100 of Who primary to a 2FE school. However, the annual review of place planning strategy outlined additional grant allocations which will be used to fund this projected overspend. The remainder of the smaller overspends reported have been rectified by a series of additions through grants and developer contributions that were agreed by full council on the 10th of November. Within each service area, information relating to the progress of each scheme is set out for members to see. Just to highlight some of the schemes that we've actually completed this year, they include the Vines site improvements, Jackson's Field and Borstal Rec green spaces improvements, various play park refurbishments, Capstan car park improvements, and the Command of the Heights Phase 2. And lastly, further amendments to the capital programme are set out in section 9 to the report, and these changes were too late for round 2, but will be incorporated in round 3.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Any members have points? Councillor Maple.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and Andy, as always, thank you for your detailed, close to £500 million of reporting. I dread to think the interest the taxpayers of Medway may be paying on some of that. I want to raise a broad point, which is around and there's a number of schemes where there is mention of Section 106. And in good times, that's probably a reasonable assumption to say, actually, you know, developers are developing, they're going to make their contribution because of the impact to the community, and we've got a plan to spend it. That's great. We know, although albeit one of the two reports was withdrawn before it was received by Planning Committee, £1 million worth of Section 106 was being asked to be withdrawn in two schemes. And that's, we're not at the start of the cost of living crisis, but we're certainly not near the end. So I know it's impossible to say what that may look like, but if we do end up in that situation where a number of developers, both with existing schemes and future schemes, come forward and say, actually, we can't afford the Section 106, it's not viable, and we have a conversation about that elsewhere, perhaps. I guess it would be, I'd like to hear from you as to what you think your anticipated processes will be around prioritisation, around decision-making as to if schemes are not viable. The current leader of the council has always been very clear around hypothecation. Therefore, if something is planned to happen with Section 106 money and Section 106 money isn't coming, my anticipation of the current leader of the council would be those schemes would be stopped because it's hypothecated funding. I'd be interested to hear from an officer perspective if that's where you think we are. I want to raise two much smaller points, but really important. I really welcome, and it's great that Trevor's here today because I'm sure he's had years worth of emails about this, and I think about our lost and much loved friend Nick Bowler when I see the Horsted gyratory finally at a point that it's nearly going to come off of the programme because it's nearly done. That's been probably a decade in the waiting. Not a big scheme, but for the residents there, and actually for most Medway residents, because that is one of the gateways to Medway, that's going to make that space safer. That is a good thing. And then finally, we were talking about this earlier on, so I wasn't going to raise it, but I will raise it. It would be helpful for the public to understand the decision-making process for the members' priority funding. And I note with interest that there are two lines there, business support members' priority funding and RCE members' priority funding. Just so the public can be clear, you know, this is around £250,000, not a small amount of money. So, because I don't think ever publicly it's been stated how that money can be spent, how people, you know, the people of Medway will see its members' priority. So if we speak to a member, what happens? So it would be really helpful. And if that's not fully available today, if that can be provided in a briefing note so we can share that with residents, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Andy.
Yeah, thank you. With regards to Section 106, the general approach of the council is that schemes are approved only when we've received the Section 106 contributions. So the risk we try and limit the risk to the council through that. So most of our schemes will only be approved when we physically got that cash in our bank account, and therefore we've got the funding. That is slightly different with some of our education schemes, and the report that we took, I think it was last July, to council highlighted where we felt there were larger risks, and obviously that's then down to members as they approve those schemes. But you're right to highlight there's obviously a greater risk at the moment of developers perhaps not wanting to change contribution levels that they once may have been happy to do, and that's obviously something that we'll have to work with as we find that out. But again, with most schemes, it's felt that we wouldn't approve, or we wouldn't ask members to approve those until we've actually got the money in. With regards to member priorities, what I would say is this is a pot of money which is set aside for members to approve, and what generally I understand is that members are approached within their communities with schemes which, if they feel like they take them forward, they bring those, and I believe they're approved through I'm sure the leader has some say in approving those, but I can come back with something more definite if I've got that wrong.
Sorry, please, Katie.
Just so a couple of things. Everything Andy said is completely correct. I think the one element about you asked about the leader and the principle of hypothecation. In approving capital schemes, council aren't only approving the scheme, so they're approving that we want to do that thing and it's going to cost X, but they're also approving that this is how it's funded. And so we might not have necessarily done so in the past, but I think moving forward, were we to swap funding, we would be talking about that very openly in Cabinet and Council reports. So we wouldn't be doing anything that members wouldn't see. So if we had included a scheme in the capital programme, and Andy's quite right, the only ones that I think we might possibly be funding in advance of actually receiving cash from Section 106s would be education schemes, which effectively we have no choice but to deliver because we've got the statutory responsibility to deliver those classes, that we would be very transparent about.
Have this one.
Thank you, I'll grab another. Thanks, Councillor May. Thank you. Oh. Thank you. And the second point about members' priorities, I think I'm right in saying that in my tenure as Head of Finance Strategy or as Chief Finance Officer, I can't recall that we've added to the programme from the members' priorities. So I'm going to ask us to take that away and double check, because in my tenure, I don't think I've done it. So I'm not sure whether we would actually be required to take a report to Cabinet and Council because we'd be moving a scheme, but I'm not sure on that. So if it's all right with you, we'll get the facts and bring something back to yourselves separately.
Thank you very much. And can I say, in response to both your responses, actually the narrative and the way the reports are now laid out makes that really clear around funding streams. The reports are brilliant, actually. I think some of the best the physical content may not always be great sometimes, so that's not the fault of anyone here, but the layout and transparency is clear. I think a briefing note on members' priorities would be very helpful indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Andy, can I just come in on the 106 agreements? Because the position is, as I understand it, that unless, in a sense, the contracting party who has obligations under a 106 fulfills those obligations, and assuming they're not amended, until those are fulfilled, the planning consent is, in a sense, not fully valid. Is that right?
All I know is that it obviously forms a part of a legal agreement, and that is entwined with the planning process. So what I would say is, if they don't fulfil that part, then the legal agreement wouldn't be completed. So
could I just make one point and then come to you, Katie? The reason I raise that aspect of it is following what Councillor Maple quite rightly said, and that is where we are now, or another committee is facing circumstances where a developer comes back seeking to reduce its own financial commitment, oblique contractual liability under the 106 because of claimed intervening financial circumstances and so on. Those matters have to be, or would have to be, resolved before a valid planning consent remained in place, as I understand it. Katie.
Thank you. I think on the first point, we're accountants, and I'd have to defer to the planner. So I think we'll double check with Dave and confirm that outside of here if that's okay. But just to take you back to the key point for us is that for the most part, our capital programme is based on developer contributions that we've already received, i.e. the planning has been dispersed. I think the only risk would be around schools, I think.
Thank you very much. I think, Councillor Johnson. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Cumming. Thank you, Chair. We had a discussion at Rural Liaison where Katie talked about £40,000 for about an hour, and now we're having a discussion where we're talking about £500 million possibly for about an hour. So I'm not sure who's ahead on the minutes per pound on that one. Thank you very much for the report. I've got some questions about revenue. We're just doing the capital now. Yes. Is that right? Yeah. Right. I take Councillor Maple's points about the clarity. I don't know, it's me. I'm a bit uncertain about some of the capital funding for the schools. So I'd just like to talk it through a little bit, if that's okay. So we have £472 million overall capital programme, of which £36 million is schools, roughly £21 million is SEND, roughly. The implications, I think, are that there are a number of different ways in which that's funded. So some of it is grant, which I take to mean we are just given that money, and presumably providing we spend it appropriately. We don't, there's no cost for that. We also have other, this other sort of stream, which we've talked about in this committee before, which is Section 106, but if not Section 106, then borrowing, and if not borrowing, then prudential borrowing. Now, I think we've raised that, and I've got concerns about the vagueness of that, but, you know, that's what we're doing. This report brings something new to it, which is the costs of converting from borrowing to prudential borrowing. So I think in that respect, I've got two questions. One is, of the capital spending for schools, places, so we're talking about basic needs, as Casey says, we don't have any choice with this, we've got a statutory obligation to provide these places. Of that expenditure, how much is covered by those grants? My understanding would be very little, because the basic needs grant, certainly in previous years, has been minimal, a couple of £1 million or something. How much of that's covered by grant? How much of it is borrowing? What's the revenue interest cost on those borrowings is one sort of set of questions. The other is, if it's possible to quantify it, what's the cost of the conversion to prudential borrowing? You know, how does that work? Is that, it may be a relatively small amount, but you know, I'd be interested to know what that looks like. I don't know whether any of that are particularly helpful questions, but those are the sorts of things I don't quite understand.
Thank you. With regards to basic needs, you are right that in recent years we haven't had a basic needs grant, so we have been reliant on Section 106 contributions for a lot of the works. And as Katie pointed out, some of those, because of the need to provide school places, we have borrowed in lieu of those Section 106 contributions in some cases. And what we've done in certainly recent reports is we've highlighted where an amount is asked for. We split that between knowing we've actually got money in, others where we've got some of the monies in but not all of it, and others where we've signed an agreement but none of those monies have come in, so they all carry a greater risk as you go further down that line. And what we're trying to do is highlight where that risk is. What I would say is we have received a £17 million of basic needs grant, which was covered in Paul Clark's School Places review report, and he'll be bringing further schemes forward, as were highlighted in that report, which a lot of them will be funded through that £17 million. So there is a lot more grant funding. What I'd say is on the basic needs, there's very little that's actually what I'd call pure borrowing. Most of it is Section 106, which hopefully won't need to be borrowing. If we, again, as Katie pointed out, if it came to a point where that money was no longer available, we would obviously bring a report back to Cabinet and to Council where we would explain the costs of converting that to borrowing, and that would be dependent on the economic conditions and the costs of borrowing at that point in time, and sort of the life of the asset that we were and the value of that asset that we were looking to create.
Thank you for that. That's very clear. I'm surprised by £17 million basic need grant when previously, before, when I was talking about sort of 2019, it was 2.5 million. And then we got an advance on that, didn't we? And then for something which escapes me, and then we didn't get it for the following 2 years, and now it's 17 million. Is that a recognition of the pressures that Medway's under in terms of its school places? Has government suddenly read Christmas Carol? I just wonder, you know, it just seems so different.
I have to say, I'd have to refer back to the children and adults team to give the details of that, but I would say it was a one-off grant that was given to us in recognition that we needed to provide, I believe it was around 600 extra school places. So it may have been a recognition that maybe calculations had changed, circumstances had changed, but I think we can certainly come back with some more detail on that one if required, unless anyone else knows.
Katie?
No, just to say that we were so shocked by the figure that we double-checked it. So, yeah, I completely agree. Welcome, though, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes you wonder if they got the decimal place in the wrong place. Yeah, but no, okay. Can I just add, Cornwallis, the proposed school, it's not due for, it's not going to be in for a few years. My understanding that was going to be funded through the Free Schools programme, but the report says about our contribution. Again, that might be a question best directed at the children.
Sorry, it is mainly our contribution, which was agreed, I think was £750,000. But I think the vast majority of that is funded through the Department for Education. But it was an agreed amount as at the time.
Right, I think that's news. It may not be news within the council, but it's certainly news, I would guess, it's certainly news to me, because all the free schools have been fully funded without any contribution from the council. I appreciate it's a relatively small sum, but it all adds up.
Obviously happy to double check, but I'm fairly sure that formed part of the original report that I'm now struggling to remember which route it went through. Obviously it went to Cabinet and Council at some point, but we'll double check and share it outside of here if that's okay.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Cooper, I think.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Could I ask about the commissioning item? It's talking about overnight short breaks. You might not be able to answer this. In the residential buildings to ensure better services received for children with disabilities. And we welcome the refurbishment of the Elaine Centre. But as members will know, especially on our committee, we want to know about ought even, because this has been something of a thing for us to ask, because we don't know what's happened to this building, we don't know what's going on with it. It seems to have gone off the radar. So could someone please explain, if it's possible, please, what's happening to this building?
Sorry, what I would say, Councillor, is obviously the budget that is there is a very small budget remaining that's left over, just dealing with some last issues. So there is nothing else in the capital programme. Now, obviously, if something else is brought forward, that members can consider that to be included in a future capital programme.
Katie, can you add to that?
I was going to say.
Thank you. Just that I think it's probably something we need to take back to colleagues in children and adults and ask them to provide an update to you, if that's all right. It's not something, because it's not in our live capital programme, I just don't know the answer, sorry.
Thank you. Yep, all questions are good. Councillor Curry, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a number of questions. If I start, I'll just go through the report. Starting with relation to, there's a £24,000 overspend on the regen budget. Is that underspent? Underspent. Okay, ignore my first question while I get my head together. Moving on, page 133, English Coastal Path. And this came up at the Rural Liaison Committee on the other evening. And it was in relation to the capital works being nearly completed, and the Grain Parish Council were concerned about the revenue implications for them and whether they were being asked to do the maintenance. Obviously, any capital programme has a revenue implication. And I just wondered if it was possible to give any clarity as to who's responsible for the maintenance of the path now that it's completed, and just some reassurance to Grain Parish Council. I don't know whether you can answer that tonight, but it'd be helpful on that one.
Sorry, on that one, I haven't got a clue.
Right,
We would
okay.
need to check with
I
officers.
didn't think you would have.
Yeah, we'll get that information to you outside of the committee.
But I was asked to ask the question. So. Okay, and then moving on to page 134, which is the HIF programme. Now, obviously, this is quite a major and quite controversial issue. I know that the WHO Development Framework consultation finishes tomorrow, and obviously there's been a lot of comments coming in on that. And one of the comments focuses around spending on the rail infrastructure and whether that's a sensible use of money. So I was just wondering about the flexibility of the HIF money to move away from the rail and be used for other purposes. That's a question which I think I know the answer to, but I'm asking it here in the committee for other purposes. And in addition to that, the paragraph halfway down the page talks about inflation and interest rates rising and the implications of economic pressure and stuff like that on the programme. Discussions with Homes England, our project partner, are underway and such like, and it's nothing set in stone here. It quite clearly says we are confident that Homes England shares our commitment to delivering this scheme and that we will reach a mutually acceptable resolution to the issues created by the current economic climate. Now, I'm aware that the planning applications for both road and rail should be in by next February, March time. However, bearing in mind the economic situation and the responses on the WHO Development Framework, that timetable is likely to slip in my reading of this. So what are the implications in terms of the HIF funding? Are we aware of, where are we with the conversations with Homes England? I think the cut-off date would be 2025 in March when things should be underway. But if we haven't got planning applications in because there's a delay, or we haven't got contractors appointed, which takes a long time before the end of next year, 2025 is suddenly looking like a very wobbly date to start things going. So there's a lot of questions around the HIF, and I just wondered if it was possible to have some reassurances about the conversations we're having with Homes England over this at the current time. And I've got another question further down, if that's right, Chair, but I'll leave that one there.
Of course, I'll attempt to answer that one then. So the Future Who project, the Housing Infrastructure Fund grant, was based on a bid which contained a set of aspirations for the area, didn't it, delivering infrastructure across 3 key areas. My understanding is that in order to change that, we would need to make another formal agreement with Homes England. So I'm fairly confident that it's not Medway's gift to simply change that project without their agreement. And I understand that's what those conversations are looking at. So as the report says, Homes England are reviewing all of their housing infrastructure fund schemes because, in common with our entire capital programme and most of the world right now, we're seeing cost increases across all of this stuff. I think in terms of those inflationary pressures, Homes England, obviously, the HIF funding package is a fundamental part of the government's plan to deliver the housing in line with the targets that it's set. And so that statement from the service about feeling confident that Homes England are committed to the project, I can only assume that that's also true because they are committed to those targets, and this is really fundamental to delivering those, isn't it? So I am sure that those conversations, certainly not happening between Homes England and accountants, but with the relevant senior people in the services, that their aim is to try and find a way through that's deliverable for everyone within the envelope that we've been given, I think. In terms of timetable slippage, so the any time that the overarching plan for that scheme has changed, has been subject to a Cabinet and Council report, hasn't it? So the last time the GDA, I think the date changed, didn't it? Back to 2025, that was subject to a Cabinet report. I'm not aware, I've certainly not seen anything formal about further slippage, but were that to be required, I think that would be a subject of a Cabinet report, so I'd keep an eye on the forward plan if something were to come up. But yeah, I don't know anything more concrete than that. I hope that's sort of some help.
That is, thank you very much. Yeah. Could I move on to another question? May I? Thank you. Two other issues that come up on page 139 in relation to Innovation Park Medway. It's kind of a similar question in some respects. If I can just find the page. In relation to the funding, obviously we're expecting the result of the Levelling Up Fund bid in December, and whatever that comes in at is going to pay for this 6-storey building as part of the scheme. However, in the inflationary world that we're now living in, that may not be likely. I think it's £13.7 million or something like that. The cost of the building will have significantly gone up, and the Levelling Up Fund money is not like to have gone up. So are we going to look at one of those schemes where we're not going to take it forward at this stage, or are we going to say, well, we'll have to find the money from somewhere in order to deliver Innovation Park Medway? So there's a question around that. And then my other final question is on page 139140 in relation to Medway Development Company, and that is in relation to Section 106 withdrawal of the contributions. It didn't reach planning, but Medway Development Company, in relation to Garrison Point, we're going to take out £600,000+. Are we likely to see more of that, because they're clearly struggling at some level or another? And also, I note that in the list of the projects under Medway Development Company, there Garrison Point doesn't get a mention, which is a worry as well. So, thank you.
I'll attempt some of those. Andy, feel free to jump in if I miss something. The Innovation Park Medway, obviously really ambitious set of schemes there, subject to the outcome of that funding. Obviously, like all schemes like this, they're backed by a viability and an assessment of cost, and I think that officers will need to be looking at what might be deliverable if that funding bid isn't received, or if it's not received at an amount that's commensurate with what's already planned. But as this is in the capital programme, any changes will go through the same governance process. So if it were necessary to slow, change, stop a scheme like this, that would be a completely transparent decision, certainly not one made by officers, and certainly not one made by accountants either. So I can guarantee that would be a very public change if that would be the outcome. And similarly, if a decision was taken that scheme was so viable that even without that funding we felt as a body that it was the right thing to do, then that would again be a decision for Cabinet and Council. I think in terms of MDC, and are we likely to see more developers seeking to reduce contributions, or I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but the world looks incredibly difficult at the moment. That said, we maintain quite close communications with MDC, and they are, by all accounts, doing really well, delivering really good stuff for Medway, and are continuing to push forward with some schemes that are really important to regeneration in Medway in areas that wouldn't otherwise happen. So I think as a council, it might be possible that we find ourselves in a place where we need to make a decision that potentially, and I'm not talking about MDC, and I'm certainly not talking about any real live examples here, but it might be a situation where the right thing for the area is to take a smaller contribution in order to see something delivered. But again, that would be a matter for a piece of appropriate governance and a decision, because that would be talking about changing the funding of a scheme that's in the capital programme. So my understanding is that isn't something that we could just do without that formal governance route. The only one I wasn't sure about is that last point, which I think Andy does know.
Yeah, I can take the point. Apologies. Garrison Point is on the former Whiffins Avenue car park, and unfortunately we've mentioned it as Whiffins Avenue here, but it is Garrison Point. What we'll do is we'll make sure in future we label it correctly. I think it was known under a dual point for quite some time, but it is obviously, because it's there, it's Garrison Point, and everyone knows it as that, so we'll make sure we change it in future.
Yeah, Garrison Point is only the developer's name for the site. Whiffins Avenue will be the postal address in part, I suspect. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Again, forgive me if this does appear in other places, but I'm a bit concerned about a few things. And one of them is, and Councillor Curry is quite right at pointing out that the report appears to show a 24 million underspend in regen. Is this because it was completed before splashes was included? That's number one. And the other thing is, I do see Section 106 money being referred to in more than just schools and education throughout the document, and I'm not going back on that, just to point it out. But I would have a question. I understand we can't use revenue money to fund capital, but I see here we're using, capital money to fund revenue, but I see we're using revenue money to fund the shortfall in capital projects. I draw your attention to the Rochester new pay and display machines, where there's 44,000. I know it's a small amount in the overall scheme of things, but it's the principle around here. And thirdly, I do come back to MDC. The council funded at MDC. Is our loan to them at risk? Are there any indications? Because they're, and I can understand why they're trying to reduce the 106. Every developer has come back to planning with things like that. But I'm more worried about actually the money that we lent them to be set up in the first place. I also have a problem with MDC and their governance, but that's not for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I take the 24 million is 24,000 underspend, and it's just a scheme where we've completed it, we don't need it anymore. So with regards to Section 106, yes, there are Section 106 developer contributions that are used throughout all the directorates. A lot of them are within regeneration, community and environment, and a lot of those are in green spaces areas, and we're, again, as we mentioned, we carefully ensure that we only bring capital schemes forward to members when we've actually received the money from developers. So again, we're not at risk there with those. And obviously with MDC, what I would say is we're having very regular conversations with the management of MDC, who are, and I know Chief Operating Officer and Chief Finance Officer are very keen on making sure business cases stack up. So we're gaining all the assurance that we can. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add any more, Katie.
Just one final thing on that loan, that's absolutely right. So the other thing just to bear in mind is that we didn't lend MDC 120 million on day one. They've actually taken sort of cash flow loans, basically. So they're borrowing what they need to spend out and repaying that. And we've got no concerns at this point about their ability to meet their liabilities to the council. So, yep.
Colleagues, thank you very much. I'll come to the Vice Chair. We have a recommendation, page 148. Councillor T.J. please.
Thank you, Chair. I move that the committee has noted the results of the second round of capital budget monitoring for 2022-2023 and the management actions to resolve the projected overspend in children's and adults, which will be subject for future report to both Cabinet and Council.
Okay, Katie?
Sorry, it's just a timing issue. So this report was published for Cabinet on the 15th and Council happened on November the 10th. So we couldn't reflect, we didn't know what the decision was going to be, so we couldn't reflect that addition in this. So it'll be in round 3.
Okay, fine. So we have a proposal. Is that seconded? Councillor Clark. Can I see those in favour, please? Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. We've been in session for 2 hours, so we will now take the usual short break. Okay. Members, officers, those following us on live stream, YouTube, we will now resume the meeting of Business Support Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We have reached agenda item number 9, which is round 2, present financial municipal year revenue budget monitoring. The report to be introduced by Dave Reynolds. David, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this report presents the results of the second round of budget monitoring process for our revenue budget of £373 million. The overall position is an overspend of £14 million, which is a worsening of around £1.5 million since the round 1 report. The key pressures in children and adults are a £7.7 million overspend on children's services, because both the number of placements and unit costs are considerably above budget. There is a £4 million overspend in adult social care, primarily due to the similar reasons around kind of number of placements and unit costs of those placements. A £5.3 million overspend on education that will impact the general fund, with a further £5 million overspend against the DSG. However, the safety valve programme is expected to resolve that pressure in the medium term. Business support is forecast to overspend by £1.7 million, with almost a £1 million pressure around staffing costs in legal services, and around £500,000 on the benefit subsidy scheme in finance being the key issues. There is also an underspend on central services of £4 million, which represents the final year of the minimum revenue provision holiday. The net underspend of £240,000 on RCE services is broadly a £1 million underspend on frontline services, arising mainly from waste with high recyclate prices and income for KCC's residents' use of our HWRCs, offset by pressures on regeneration of around £500,000, along with pressures on culture and community, primarily around planning and additional consultants' costs, along with a shortfall on fee income. The position is a significant one, as an overspend of this scale, if it materialises, would require the use of £19 million of Council's limited reserves. So the report went to Cabinet on the 15th of November, and Cabinet instructed officers to exercise tight control and to identify management action to bring the overspend down. The third round of monitoring is underway. That will be reported back to Cabinet in February alongside the budget for 23-24. So happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Johnson, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Dave, very much for that. Overall, it doesn't look great, and there are some children's elements which are contributing to the general air of gloom at the moment. The 7.7 million on placements, I think, is well understood. This committee's discussed it at length, and Children's Committee's discussed it at length. The 5.3 million education overspend comes as something of a surprise, but I think even then we've also had hints, suggestions that it was coming. That's SEN transport, isn't it? Transport growth, all those sorts of issues which are accumulating. Yeah. The issue really is that children's services, both in the education and children and social care areas, are demand-led. So we can set budgets as much as we like, but actually if a young person turns up with expensive needs, those needs have to be met. So that's always going to be the problem. At times at times where the purse strings are less tight, that wouldn't be an issue, but it particularly is at the moment. So none of that's particularly helpful. I think we understand a lot of those processes. I would like to pick up on the discussion on page 153 about the high needs block deficit, the safety valve intervention programme. Again, this committee but also Children's Committee has discussed that on a number of occasions and at length. I think we understand or have understood the issues that have got us where we are. But it was very strange that the report that was intended to go to September's Children's Committee was pulled practically on the night. I mean, I think it was 2 days before technically when I was contacted, but at the night the committee had to agree not to proceed with it, which we were happy to do on the officer's recommendation. That report indicated that we were going to be asking for something like £28 million of revenue support for the high needs block alleviation. So the plan is that the officers have a detailed plan for recovery. Some of that requires expenditure, some of it is reallocation, some of it is reprioritisation. We have some issues about how that might look, but if we just strictly keep to the numbers, the money, if that plan is implemented, we would get that 28 million. The report that's going next Tuesday, and it's been published, so it's in the public domain, as you'll be aware. The sum is 17 million. That's a loss of 11 million. And in fact, from this report, but also the report on Tuesday, there are other changes as well. So there are changes which are coming, where expenditure is coming out of the High Needs Block grant and are going into the general fund. So just a quick technical question. General fund just means the sort of normal level of expenditure. It's not sort of apportioned away like the High Needs Block is. General fund is general expenditure. Yeah. So money's coming out of High Needs Block going into the general fund. We're getting £11 million less than we were. I just wonder what's happened between the DFE getting back in touch with us in September, resulting in that report being pulled, and now, because we are considerably worse off. We're £11 million directly worse off in terms of the high need block reduction. We're also, I guess, 2.9 million per annum, so each year from now on, that will be increased by inflation, worse off out of the general fund. I feel as if there's lots going on, and I'd like to understand a bit more about what is going on, because this is absolutely crucial. That's a lot of money that, if I can put it crudely, we've lost. I mean, I know it wasn't agreed in September. I know this one isn't agreed either. But that's the, unless it gets pulled on Tuesday, that's the report that's going. That's what we're being led to believe. That seems extraordinary. I'm just keen to know what's been happening.
Yeah. So obviously the safety valve programme is still in the process of kind of being agreed, and obviously there is a paper going. Obviously the paper going to CYP on Tuesday. It might be better to pick up some of these questions there, because you've got obviously education people there as well. It is broadly one issue around what we've been able to charge the DSG, and obviously that is the kind of cumulative effect of it, which is the difference between the kind of the 28 and the 17 million. So it all hinges on that kind of that one figure of like the 2.9 million pounds, which is the annual kind of amount. And obviously over the years the length of the safety valve programme, that is the 12 million pounds kind of difference between what we were expecting to get from the safety programme and what we will do now. It does obviously represent a pressure to the revenue budget going forward, and it is built into the draft budget for next year.
If I may? Okay, yeah, I take that point, and we often in these discussions, it's difficult to know whether it's a strictly fine. Often you need the directorate officers there to inform the discussion as well. So absolutely accept that. But this is here now with us, so I'm taking the opportunity to talk it through. There seems to be a bit of an implication in what you're saying that the 2.9 million issue, which is going to be resolved by the change, has been an issue as yet undiscovered or unappreciated hitherto in terms of how that high needs block deficit, high needs block was dispersed. Is that a reasonable?
If that's all right, I'll jump in there, Chair.
Katie, please.
So I suppose the safety valve programme isn't us effectively invoicing the government for our deficit, right? So there's a whole programme of activity that's gone into getting us even to this stage. And so that's been talking about, there are some sort of overarching principles about some things that we need to do that have been tied into the SEND strategy and that form the sort of basis of our recovery plan moving forward. So we've had to sort of co-produce a recovery plan with schools and academies about how we're going to fund this stuff moving forward. There's lots of other improvement activity. One strand of that activity was reviewing what we actually, as a council, charge to the DSG. And in one earlier version of the plan, which is, I'm not sure why the report was pulled, so I'm not kind of commenting on that, but the one earlier version of the plan, we'd assumed some specific services that we'd been funding in the current year budget from dedicated schools grant resources. Actually, in order for us to make it through to the next round of this programme, we needed to accept that we would spend that money on those services out of our general fund resources instead. So as Dave said, the current round monitoring and the draft budget that are on this agenda both reflect the impact of that already. So this isn't kind of another new issue that we need to add to worsen either the current year or the draft budget gap. But yeah, it just represents among that work a reflection on where it's more appropriate to charge some of those services to. And that's the impact, the cumulative impact of that review.
Okay, thank you, Casey. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just need to reflect on that a little, if that's okay. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Maple.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the report. It's not pleasant reading. And of course, it's worth recognising that this is, we're £18 million behind, but we knew we'd be £4 million behind at the start of the process. We know that. I want to pick up a few points, if I may, in no particular order, because unhelpfully, the electronic version doesn't have page numbers, which is something we need to definitely get better about at some point. So I just want, the first one I want to focus on, and Councillor Curry might pick this up, I don't know, but the planning overspend, you know, at a time when planning is busier than ever, and I can see there's planning members in this room who are going to more presentations than ever, and there's a lot going on. You know, we all receive that weekly list, and that is 10, 12, 14, 16 pages of applications coming in every single week. The fact that they're £1/3 roughly, over budget at the moment, there is some mitigation within here, but I'm concerned that actually, and it's got worse since obviously the first quarter. So I just want to get an understanding as to whether is that in part because, for example, the additional work on the local plan just wasn't in the original budget, and now we're having to do it, and therefore, or the HIF, or the other big schemes, because it says here, obviously, there's been quite a lot of use, for example, of consultants. So an understanding around that would be helpful. A small one, because it's a small amount of money, but just worth getting some clarity. Obviously, and for the avoidance of doubt, I've said this elsewhere, I think Medway handled the whole London Bridge operation very well. I think we were, both in the sense of even from the full council meeting that was due to happen on the evening itself. So no criticism of the process. I just wonder whether there was, you know, whether we have got to pick up the tab for that, or whether there's any central funding from Cabinet Office, Home Office, etc. on that particular matter. And if you want to answer for the next, whether there's anything specifically, I suspect not around a coronation in particular, whether there's any funding streams coming down the road for that. Tiny amounts in the grand process of what we're dealing with, but important to the people of Medway. Those of us who were around at the time, nobody didn't support us taking on the Pentagon Centre for the strategic reasons that were laid out at the time, although I physically wasn't in the room because at that point I had a conflict of interest. I don't anymore, thankfully, so I can talk freely about everyone's favourite Chatham-based shopping centre. It's got £250,000 pressure, and I wondered how those discussions to reduce this pressure are ongoing? How are those discussions happening? And what are the sorts of things in the Pentagon where there are still occasionally leaks, where there's still occasionally materials in the building which people wouldn't want to be there? You know, those are all going to add some cost to this. So I'd be interested to hear how those conversations are going. I then want to turn to the very large overspend on something which is very specifically for this committee, and that's the issue of legal services. I recall saying both here and at the budget meeting, I had concerns around what I thought were the ambitious savings targets that the legal and governance department were looking at making. And we're in a situation where not only are those targets not being met, we're in a really uncomfortable position of more than £1 million pressure. So I want to understand, and it may be that Sam may comment on this from a recruitment perspective. You know, if we continue, one of the problems I've been told about consistently, not just in legal, but in different bits of the council, is our reliance still, not because we want to, but because there's no other option, on locums, on consultants. Those cost Medway taxpayers a large amount of money. So I want to get an understanding as to two things, really. Where are we around trying to get that deficit down, that £1 million down? And actually, what are the expectations for savings for the forthcoming budget? Because at the moment, the estimates that were put into this current financial year's budget are completely wrong, quite clearly. And then finally, I just want to check on the issue of Medway North. So obviously we've got around about £500,000 coming back to us, probably. Although obviously there are pressures of all of their utilities, all of their inflationary pressures, the national minimum wage going up, which will impact on some of their workers. But I noted as well, there's a pressure around the core contract of £100,000 for the council. So it worries me, as with so many of these council organisations, that we might be getting £500,000 back, perhaps, but actually we're paying out an extra £100,000 that we hadn't budgeted for. So are we really only getting £400,000 back? There we go. My questions. Thank you.
Dave.
Okay, thanks. So the planning overspend, we probably need to check some of the detail out with the service. Obviously, as it says in the report, the core reason is the fact that they use those consultants. I don't know sitting here whether they are consultants who have been kind of utilised on the kind of the local plan or what they've been used on. Obviously, similar to kind of other kind of areas of the council, recruitment is an issue, isn't it? So it may be that they are kind of covering kind of actually established posts, but I don't know that sitting here, but we can certainly kind of pick that up for you. In terms of Operation London Bridge, we've had no kind of notification of any kind of grant funding coming through. Don't know if that's because it's a fairly kind of in the grand scheme of things quite a small sum for kind of individual councils, although nationally it's probably quite a large amount. And likewise, we've not seen anything about anything for a kind of coronation kind of thing. But occasionally we get new burdens funding coming out of left field that we weren't expecting. So it may come through, but we're certainly not planning for it at this stage. Sorry, I have to catch up with Pentagon. Yeah, I don't know, Kate, you might want to pick up on the Pentagon possibly, because you might be a bit closer to some of that detail.
If I may, Chair. I think the first thing to say with the Pentagon is that I think I'm right in saying that it still washes its face, i.e. the income is still more than the expenditure, albeit it's not at the target level. And I think the shortfall this year is particularly around level 1 having been taken out of use effectively. And my understanding is that that's a very short-term issue. So obviously once that development's done, we anticipate income will be back up to where we want it to be. So hopefully fairly positive there. I think if I just jump in and pick up your last couple, so legal services, I think a large part of that additional spend is additional work around children's social work, effectively, so supporting cases going through courts there. I think we're all very familiar with the issues in children's services, and that's the right thing to do, although they are part of the first cohort of the sort of work around reviewing our pay and grading structure, so that work might yield some benefit to retention of in-house staff in that area, we would hope. And then finally, Medway North is probably the one I know the least about, actually, and I think we might have to catch up with the service. So I know that we're having lots of conversations with Medway North at the moment, chiefly around next year and what those pressures might look like and what we might be able to do about them. But obviously with round 3 open at the moment, we've currently got officers giving a better estimate right now. That will come much faster to the committee than it did last year. So you might remember last year, round 3 didn't get considered by Cabinet until March. This year it's coming alongside the final budget in February, so we've shaved a month off of that. So I'm not kind of delaying too long. It only makes its way to CMT at the end of January, so it's a very, very quick turnaround to get it to members. But I'm afraid I'd have to take that one away. I'm not confident I know the answer here, sorry.
Could I just come in with a question, Dave? Councillor Maple touched on both the financial situation with legal services and with planning. Can you clarify if, as it were, an internal department makes use of our legal services, our joint services, and, for example, instructs counsel on a lengthy planning inquiry, are those costs, in essence, charged back to planning, or are they costs that rest with legal services?
I think it's a mixture of both, to be honest. There are some cases where the council fees, so if you take the case of the children's kind of services cases, those council fees will sit with the legal services department. If there are specific pieces of work that services have asked legal services to do and they're not able to service them internally, then those charges may be picked up by the individual departments.
Yeah, I mean, Councillor Maple asked the point about planning. So that's why I'm particularly interested whether that position reflects the finance, as it were, allocate those charges back to planning and hit their budget, or do legal keep hold of that expenditure?
And even on that one, things like the local plan will have their own kind of, they've got their own kind of reserve to fund the local plan expenditure. And so any expenditure which is incurred in the nature of the local plan will be charged there.
I'm particularly thinking, Dave, because that's what we're told on the committee so much, the cost of appeals, planning inquiries, are those charged back to the planning budget?
Yes. So what legal will be picking up is the counsel fees, the court fees, the actual hiring of solicitors to support other elements. Children's social care had a budget that was sitting in children's but was centralised. So that budget is now sitting in legal services. I think the decision that was taken in the current year budget build was that our legal services need to work more closely with other services and support them in terms of making choices about what should be externalised and what should be internalised. And obviously our monitoring officer is the person who should be helping the rest of the organisation to make that decision. My understanding is that the position being reported here on planning is a true representation of the costs of planning, i.e. we aren't hiding costs associated with the local plan in the legal budget, if that's the...
No, I'm not talking about local plan. I'm talking about planning appeals, planning inquiries, where normally our defence of a decision to refuse will be conducted by external counsel, as I understand it, from Dave Harris. Where would that cost show? In whose internal budget does that show?
And I think that the cost of those do get picked up from that reserve. So it's not just a local plan reserve, it's a local plan and appeals reserve, effectively. So that those kind of costs will be picked up from there. I think I will double check and come back to you.
Okay, because some of the planning inquiries can be very lengthy. Councillor Mayfield.
I wonder, I don't want to create work for the sake of it, but I do think following this conversation, and actually if you think back to the budget meeting, part of the rationale for the savings was the fact that effectively, these are my words, not anybody else's, a load of the stuff that I thought would sit with legal actually was almost delegated to the individual departments. So I wonder if a briefing note at this stage, just to get a bit more, for all of us, a bit more clarity as to the budget lines, because actually, really, with just those 2 points in hand, actually, is that 300,000 in planning actually closer to £500,000, and £200,000 of it is sitting on legal, or indeed vice versa. And I think, to be fair to officers here tonight, it's a conversation that needs to happen. I think as well, I mean, the other part of the council I'd want to have that information for, I think, is children's services, because again, I suspect, depending on the types of cases, depending on the processes and all the rest of it, I don't want to know how every penny in legal is spent and which budget line it should be on, but I think though, because they're quite big, chunky amounts of money, they're absolutely both in the public domain. We're asked about children's services and the local plan and planning all of the time. So I think that would be a helpful, hopefully pretty short piece of work, just to say, break it down as to which budget lines are which. Thank you.
I think that will be, I completely agree. I think that would be very helpful. Sam, is there anything from an HR perspective you'd like to put in?
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely, some of the pressure is around the recruitment challenges we've got and the reliance on locums. One of the things that is really concerning the service at the moment is where we've got quite a flat structure where there's been an increase of work, it's quite difficult to manage. So even bringing locums in, actually, the pressure at the top for the strategic heads of service is becoming quite problematic. So one of the reasons we identified the areas that needed to go into the phase 1 of the MedPay review is based on high cost and perhaps the structures not being okay. So we did start just looking at the one side of the legal team. We have now broadened that out to do a whole review of the legal services, because this is about nurturing talent and succession planning as well, and making it an attractive offer to come and work at Medway. So the narrative has moved on, recognising the challenges that there are to recruit, not just because there's a massive gap in the market, but equally because the structures we've got don't necessarily align itself to allow progression throughout the service area. We do have an issue in children's services and within the legal team, as well as other areas, where agencies are approaching people and offering people posts. This is almost double the salary they're on at the moment, and this is common for not just us, but many local authorities. So our added benefits around our employee value proposition has got to be something we've got to maximise. We're not ever going to be in a position where we can offer the same pay as private sector, but actually we do have a lot of benefits that are of value. So we're maximising that piece of work across the council as well to make us more competitive in the market.
Yeah, thanks. I would just comment that in a lot of professions, people who live in Medway have the opportunity, maybe for up to 3 out of 5 working days, to stay in Medway and work from home in a London job, many of whom still get London waiting for that. So I think that's a pressure, I would guess, on HR for very obvious reasons. Social workers, lawyers, right across the board, I would suspect. Yeah. Okay, but thanks for those. Councillor Curry, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to raise the issue around planning, but I think most of the points, particularly the HR points, so thank you for that, because it's really helpful. Because it was about recruitment, is a real problem for the planning team. And actually, I suspect we're forking out more on consultants than we would do if we actually were able to employ. So the work is being done to resolve that problem is good to hear. So that was that point. I would like to move on, if I can, to page 155 of the report, where it mentions specifically, and this isn't so much, I have a couple of questions, but this isn't a question, this is a request, which I have made. This is the 4th time I'm making this request, to increase the green spaces budget, if it's at all possible. They have had their budget frozen for a couple of years now at least, and I mean, we mentioned right at the start of the meeting about social value. I mentioned natural capital. The investment that we make in our green spaces pays huge dividends in terms of people's health and well-being, both physical and mental, and reduces costs on our services significantly. And only a small increase in budget can make a massive difference if only we pursued that natural capital investment route in our thinking. So I'm just putting that out there again. Those the powers that be, can you please look at the green spaces budget and say that they actually could do with some more? And I note then, if you go down to the next page on the report, halfway down, it talks about environmental services having an underspend of £1.337 million for various reasons relating to that. So what a question there is, what happens to that money? Does it just go back into the general pot, or can some of it be recycled within to the green spaces in particular? That's a request there. And then a very specific question is in relation to Norse and the hydrogenated vegetable oil fuel. It's £80,000. It's not a great deal of money, but why are we paying that? I mean, it sounds like a capital expenditure on their vehicles, and it also sounds like something that they should be paying for rather than us. And I just kind of wonder if there's any other, why are we doing that? And also if there are other costs like popping up throughout where actually we're giving them money when actually they're working for us. So I would be interested to know just specifically if we know anything about that £80,000. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Dave?
Thanks. So in terms of kind of the green spaces budget, obviously note your request. In terms of the overall kind of frontline services budget and where you've kind of got underspends and overspends, the bottom line is yes, they do go back into kind of deliver the overall kind of bottom line for the council. So when services are underspending, there isn't any provision to roll that money forward to kind of future years. That doesn't mean that when we look at the budget setting process that you couldn't look at realigning some of those budgets within directorates, but obviously that would need to go through kind of the teams that run those services. And I suppose with the kind of the nature of the underspend at the moment on the kind of the mainly the recycling stuff is we don't know how long that's going to hold up as well. So that may be a temporary kind of benefit, which actually, when you look at next year's budget, isn't there to the same kind of extent. So, as through the kind of the budget bill process, those things will be looked at, but the bottom line is in the current year that the underspend will go to kind of reduce the overall council overspend effectively. And then Norse, do you want to pick that up, Katie?
I'm right on the edge of my knowledge about this issue, so apologies if I'm saying something that's incorrect, but I think this might be to do with the council declaring the climate emergency in part of our action plan. So I think our fleet becoming greener, I don't know that we anticipated the cost, and I would need to double check on that, but yeah, I'm obviously with a target to reduce our emissions in quite a short time frame. I think that's something to do with that.
Just very, you're absolutely right. It is. I mean, obviously, hydrogenated vegetable oil does actually produce less emissions, so it's good for the local air pollution levels and stuff like that. So I'm not questioning the need to do that. I'm just questioning why we're paying for it when Norse. I mean, they have their own environmental policies. I'm presumably for other authorities, they may well be doing it and stuff like that in other areas. So it seems like we've been sort of talked into paying for something that perhaps we shouldn't have been.
If I may, Chair,
Yep.
I think we'll take that away and double check, because it feels intuitively like we would be being asked to contribute to higher diesel rates if we weren't paying that. So I'm not sure if that's not a net gain, but we will check outside of it. I'm sorry. I feel like we're saying quite a lot tonight that we don't know the answer to that, but we're talking about 4,000 cost centres, and we're struggling between us to recall exactly where that one falls.
Well, as long as the information can be fed back through Steve to members, that will be helpful. Councillor Cooper next, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'm going to change the subject now. It's reference to the integrated transport. I was pleased to see that the Medway concessionary fares scheme has been renegotiated with Arriva, having got a bus pass, and I know loads of people that do have one. And I've been asked, is it still going to continue? And I said, yes, of course it is. Excuse me. But it's talking about the reduction in the contract price, an in-year saving of 390,000 due to the reduced numbers of journeys being made. Now, I know for a fact that the DFT have decided not to fund some of our bus routes, and this is why Arriva have had to change some of their number of buses that they use on routes, and my particular bus is in this. So I'm just wondering what's happened to the 390,000, and obviously the reduced bus services are causing a bit of a problem, and I was surprised to see that nothing's changed since the last tender in 2013. I mean, that's such a long time ago. So what's been going on since 2013 for it not to be retendered? And secondly, subsidised bus services, the way this is worded, I'm unclear whether this actually includes transport, for children going to school for their bus passes, because I know they have gone up. Because we see this on transport appeals. We know that there has been a difference. So I'd just be interested to see what's happening there. And going to the top of the page, when it's talking about the other pressures in highways and city fibre, they are everywhere in Medway. And they are causing not, problem with them actually putting it in, but they're causing a few problems with the traffic. It's getting a bit hazardous in places. So I'm just wondering what this the permit scheme income actually means. Does that mean that they have to go over do way leaves or conveyancing or something like this? I'm not quite of the understanding what the actual permit scheme means, and we're getting an income from that.
Yeah, again, some of these are quite service-specific questions in terms of what the answer might be. In terms of what we know about the bus service, the information we get in finance is around the kind of the activity levels. What's driving those activity levels? We probably would need to pick up with kind of the team that run an integrated transport team. So sorry about that, but I think we will have to kind of bottom that out with them about the actual kind of driver behind the reduction in numbers of journeys. Similarly, with the kind of the income around kind of the city fibre and the kind of street works things, as I understand it, they need to pay for licences to undertake that work. I imagine that as it goes through those kind of the process for kind of being approved, it is done on a kind of a merit basis, and the fact that obviously the long-term benefits of undertaking that work are for the better of the kind of local community, but obviously any work is going to have some kind of short-term inconvenience for kind of members of the public, isn't it? But as from a financial point of view, obviously we the fact that we are able, the income we can kind of able to charge for that is beneficial to the budget, isn't it? So it's not saying that that's why we're letting lots of schemes go ahead, but if we've budgeted for a certain level of activity and actually there are, because of the need of the area, there is more activity being undertaken, then that is arguably why that we're able to deliver more income in the kind of financial year than we have budgeted.
Can I just add, just clarify, as with statutory undertakers, they effectively have a right to tell us that they're coming in, albeit that we then give them a licence for a certain period of time. So we don't fully control the entitlement, as I understand it. Is that right?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as I understand it, the permitting is really just around us controlling, making sure that not every road in the same area is impacted at the same time. We can't prevent them from doing those works. And as Dave articulated, obviously, we're keen for them to do that. Yeah. Just the only other point, I think, was around the contract and how long that had not been uplifted for. And my understanding, I think, is that we let a contract with a flat price for a fixed term, and so once we relet that contract, obviously we would expect to see an uplift, and I think that's what's driving the pressure that's forecast there. But as Dave said, if we're talking about activity data and what's happened to usage in those contracts, then we would need to defer to the service and ask them to provide that to you, but we'll take that away.
Councillor Maple.
It was only a quick one, just to say there is absolutely no need for apologies from Dave and Katie and others tonight. You know, Phil made the point very clearly a couple of committees ago. Look, I think it's right. We should absolutely, as this committee, be looking at the whole budget. You know, we have that kind of grandparent role as a committee, but we don't expect. Well, we probably expect. We don't absolutely expect need to know every single line of the 4,000 line budget. So look, there is no need to apologise. We know we'll get that information. But it's right as members, we have an opportunity as business support to request that appropriately.
Yep, well said. Thank you very much indeed. Anyone else? Okay, final indicator, I think Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to come back to one that I think you do know about, which is basically the Finance Department one. I'd be worried if you didn't. A couple of things. One was around the savings within internal audit. Obviously, if there aren't enough people to do the work, and these savings are obviously around staffing, what sort of work is not being done? And the other one I have the problem with is the £500,000 of housing benefit, well, under collection, if you like, or overpayments. I used to sit on audit, and when I did, it was a very small percentage of a fraud that was done in that area. Nothing like those kind of figures. And I'm just wondering if you have some comment on that, some background on that. And also, it is said in the report that you're hoping that that £678,000 shortfall will be met somewhere along the way. Is it going to be actually met, or because some of it is from over ambitious targets, but is some of it just met from the reorganisation within the department and staff savings?
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of internal audit, I'm aware that they haven't had vacancies held, but they've had some difficulties recruiting to vacancies that they've had a couple of failed campaigns, and they're actually part of that initial cohort of the review of Medpay as well, to try and understand or try and improve long-term recruitment and retention in that service. But they are the ultimate risk managers, aren't they? So their whole plan is driven by risk, and as you'll remember from Audit Committee, or anyone who's had the pleasure of reading those reports will know that the workload is kind of constantly reviewed on a risk-based approach, so that they make sure that they direct the resources they have got to the most highest risk areas of work. So I'm confident that that wouldn't have represented a failure to deliver anything really significant. That's not to say that the work that they all do isn't significant, but also at that level, I think it doesn't give me too much concern as a representation of the value of the whole team. In terms of the housing benefit subsidy, as all this stuff is really, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So what that actually represents is, many moons ago, if we awarded housing benefit to someone, we would get essentially full subsidy in most instances. Now the government has over many years moved towards universal credit instead of locally administered housing benefit, but they haven't done that entirely, so there is still a significant local caseload for housing benefit. So whilst most cases, or new cases certainly, are all going on to universal credit, the cases that we still have, and we can still actually take new claims for, are they don't attract full subsidy, right? So the government would give us full subsidy for most cases, but they've taken all of those nice easy ones and they've sort of left us with the more complex cases and the stuff that just does not attract full subsidy. So all local authorities who administer benefit are seeing a growing impact of this sort of subsidy gap. So an element of it is that. What's also in that sort of service that we talk about is our recovery of overpaid housing benefit. We do a pretty good job of recovering overpaid housing benefit, but because we've got a really strong audit and counter fraud service, our rates relative to others are actually quite low. So that pressure, certainly a very small percentage of that would relate to overpaid housing benefit, and a tinier percentage of that would relate to fraudulently claimed stuff. The vast majority of that, easily 450, 500,000 of that, would be the gap between what the government is paying us to pay out benefit and what we have to pay out in benefit. Hopefully that's a bit clearer. Yeah, okay. And the last one, so you just asked, we've made a comment there about the shortfall being recovered along the way. So in terms of some of our kind of key lines are court costs, court fees, and we in earlier rounds talked about how we were really struggling to get court dates, and we've had some success in getting some court dates, so that line will grow slightly. Our really early indications of the latest round of budget monitoring look like the subsidy gap might be closing slightly, so we're hopeful that there's some benefit there. So I still stand by what I said. Fingers crossed we'll see a better position on finance moving forward.
Sorry, just for that clarification, I'm really grateful. Thank you, Katie.
Okay, thank you, members. I will come to the Vice Chair. We have a recommendation at 13.1, page 162.
Thank you, Chair. I move that the committee has noted the results of the second round of revenue budget monitoring for 2022-2023 and noted that Cabinet has instructed senior management to continue to exercise tight control to reduce expenditure within their areas and to identify a range of management actions to reduce expenditure or increase income.
Is that seconded? Councillor Clark. Thank you, colleagues. And I see those in favour, please. Okay, that is unanimous. Thank you, everyone. That takes us on to item 10. So the draft capital and revenue budget for 23-24 to be introduced, please. Agenda item 10 by Katie.
Thank you, Chair. And if you'll indulge me, because this is quite a long and complicated item, I'm going to give a slightly longer introduction, just walk you through what the paper's doing, if that's okay. Okay, so the draft budget for 23-24 was presented to Cabinet last Tuesday. In accordance with the Constitution, it's now making its way through the ONS committees. So any proposals for amendments will be referred back to Cabinet for consideration when agreeing the final budget in February. The process to develop this budget began back in the summer with the preparation of the Financial Outlook 22-23. No, 23-24, I'm in the wrong year, sorry. That report was intended for discussion at the September Cabinet. However, that meeting was cancelled following the passing of the Queen, obviously. So instead went to Cabinet in October. At that stage, we were projecting a potential gap of somewhere in the region of 32.5 to 56 million. The draft budget before you today was presented to the Cabinet on the 15th of November. Just a couple of days ahead of the Chancellor's announcements. So it's really important to note that this doesn't reflect any of that stuff. So if it's okay with you, Chair, I'll talk through the report as it's written, so i.e. before the government announcements. But then I'd be happy to sort of summarise what they might mean for Medway afterwards, if the committee would like that, yeah? Okay. So while the financial outlook projections were ranges, for the draft budget we've refined all of those down to our best estimate at the time of publication. In short, the draft budget assumes the following. So again, all of this is pre those autumn statement announcements. So we projected income growth of just under 22 million, so council tax of 6.5 million, which assumed the 2% general referendum limit and 1% adult social care precept. We assumed business rates growth of 5 million, ring-fence grants for education, increase of 5 million, and an estimate of the adult social care reforms funding that had previously been announced at just under 6 million. In terms of increases in the cost of services, the draft budget reflects the following: growth in budget requirement, net of the savings that are set out in the appendices B for each directorate, right? So the stuff that we've already said we can reduce. So this is the net position on that stuff. Key one, no surprises, would be children's social care and education, a net 16 million increase, 12 million on adult social care, including the cost of those reforms, around 8 million to finance our ambitious capital programme, as obviously the total amount that we're borrowing and interest rates have increased, an approximately 4 million inflationary uplift on all our contractual spend, about 2.2 million increase in cost of utilities across the council, and about 5 million on staff pay, which would have been an allowance of broadly 5%. So all of that took us to a projected gap of 28.7 million, and obviously officers are working really hard with portfolio holders at the moment to try and formulate savings proposals to address that, and we'll be discussing options with leader and cabinet members through that normal budget setting process that's running alongside this consultation process. So the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which we've taken to referring to as DLUC, are publishing a further statement on the Chancellor's announcements, which will provide us some more detail. They've said that will either be at the end of this month or the beginning of December. The actual local government settlement, we've deduced, will be published on the 20th of December because they won't do it on the day that Parliament recesses. We'll be taking a report to Cabinet in January, which will reflect the impact of those announcements on the Council's budget gap based on the actual allocations which are published on the 20th of December, we anticipate. When they considered the draft budget, just one thing to note, the other recommendation in the draft budget report to Cabinet was that they agreed to recommend to Council that assuming royal assent is granted from April 2024, we've currently got 100% premium for long-term empty properties, so on council tax, that would be brought forward, so it would commence after the property was empty for 1 year rather than 2, and that 100% premium would be charged for properties that are unoccupied but furnished, i.e. second homes. That's set out in paragraph 5.6.4 of this report, and if adopted from 24-25, because we have to give a year's notice on those adoptions, we estimate that that would generate an additional 1.127 million at today's rates. Obviously, if council tax goes up, that figure would go up. So clearly our primary focus is on revenue with the scale of the gap as things stand. But in terms of capital, the draft budget basically reflects current programme of 472 million, which we've already talked about tonight. As usual, we'll add capital grant allocations when they're announced, so things like highways grants, etc. When the education grants are finalised, we'll add that stuff in due course. And a capital strategy which will articulate our aspirations for capital investment over the longer term, which has previously been to November Cabinet, is going to be going to December Cabinet, just sort of scheduling and resources in our team have impaired our ability to get that out the door in the same schedule. There are 4 appendices to this report. So Appendix 1 is the really high-level draft budget summary. If I just walk you through what those columns mean, because I think it's really easy to, you know, just go number blind when you look at a table like that, right? So the top half of the table is the budget requirement. That shows our net expenditure budget that each directorate is projected to need to deliver their existing services. Bottom half of that table shows how that budget is funded. And working through the first column of figures then, so the first one's the current year budget. The second one reflects the removal of one-off government grant, which is basically the council tax energy rebate and a couple of other schemes that we haven't had confirmed. Third column is the adjusted base, which basically shows that 5 million-ish use of reserves that the current year budget is based on. We then show the removal of recharges, which is your sort of costs of HR, finance, legal, etc. to the rest of the organisation. Well, the fifth column shows all of the additional pressures and additional income or savings that we're projecting. So that final column is the draft budget position. That's the one at the bottom shows you is 28.7 million, and that's the gap that we need to close by February. There are 2 appendices for each directorate, A and B. A just shows the directorate's budget as it currently stands. B explains the pressures and savings that have been reflected to arrive at that. So business support are asked to comment and forward proposals to the individual ONS committees. So they start, I think they're Tuesday, Thursday and Tuesday of the following week, and ask them to bring their comments back to business support on the 25th of January, that meeting there. Okay, so if I move on to the Chancellor's announcements then. So on the face of it, the settlement was better than we were expecting, but not as good as I'd hoped, I think it's probably fair to say. However, the devil's always in the detail, so I'm nervous about these, so I would just obviously take these as our reading of that government announcement document. So on social care, the statement confirmed that the charging reforms, part of the adult social care reforms, will be delayed for at least 2 years. The settlement was actually silent on the market sustainability and fair cost of care, which is the other half of that exercise. So it's unclear whether that will still go ahead. Statement did confirm that the funding set aside for the reforms will still be distributed to local authorities, although the national quantum was slightly different. We think possibly recognising that we were previously funded for the 1.25% social care levy on national insurance, but that's not clear yet. So we think we'll get 5.2 million through that grant next year. We'd assumed 5.8 million of grant and expenditure to cover both the charging reforms and the fair cost of care and market sustainability stuff in adult social care. So of that, based on some sector briefings, we'd assumed about 3.3 million was for the charging reforms and about 2.5 was for market sustainability and fair cost of care. So you can sort of see where I'm going with this. I think we're probably reasonably safe to assume that we won't need to spend the 3.3 million, less clear on the 2.5. There's 1 billion for 23-24 of new money, which rises to 1.7 billion for 24-25 to support health and social care. 40% of that will come direct to local authorities. We estimate that probably means something in the region of 1.6 million next year and about 2.7 the year after. The other 60% of those national announcements is being routed through the Better Care Fund, which means we share it with health. So obviously up for grabs about how that is going to be spent or split, and a joint decision. On council tax, referendum limit was increased, so 1% for all councils increase and a further 1% for all adult social care authorities. So Medway could increase its council tax by just under 5%, were the administration minded to take up that flexibility. Draft budget assumes a 3% uplift, so that would represent an additional 2%, which would be about 2.8 million additional income. On business rates, headline announcement is that the multiplier, which is used to calculate individual businesses' bills, is again frozen. Although, again, the devil in the detail there, it looks like instead of being increased by inflation, about 11%, whatever that would be, it looks like it's still increasing, but capped at a much lower level, looks about under 4%. In any case, that means business rates bills won't go up as much as they otherwise would have done. The retail, hospitality and leisure relief that was introduced during COVID, that was 50% throughout COVID. That's actually going up to 75%, up from 50% in the current year. There will be a revaluation, so although council tax property valuations for council tax purposes are still based on the April 1993 figures, business rates properties are valued supposedly on a 5-year cycle, and there will be a revaluation in April 2023. We've already seen the draft lists for that, so businesses can already see what that might mean for them. But there's a really generous package of support, or more generous certainly than we've seen in previous revaluations, i.e. so if a business's bill would rise because their rateable value's gone up, there'll be government support to staircase the impact of that in rather than just take the hit all in 1 year. And there's a new supporting small businesses scheme being introduced to protect people losing support from other small business or rural rate relief. And the settlement says that local authorities will be fully compensated for all the loss of income that represents. There's a risk in the fine print about how they're calculating that compensation and whether that will genuinely account for the difference, but we wait and hope. A couple of other things then. The core schools budget's getting an additional 2.3 billion of funding for 23-24 and the same for 24-25. Looks like council funded services will continue to be a pressure though. That looks like it's going to be routed straight through the DSG. Energy bill relief scheme looks like it might exclude the public sector, which isn't our reading of the original version, so that's a bit of a concern for us. Some good news for individuals, so benefits are increasing in line with inflation as measured by September CPI. They're upholding the state pension being uprated the same measure, so triple lock confirmed. National living wage increase will go up for people over 23 by 9.7% to £10.42 an hour. Now, that's not such a big jump for us because we went to £10 an hour from April in the current year. There's a confirmation that we will lose some grant because the NI rate's changed, but that's already in our draft budget assumptions. The rent cap was set at 7%. I understand our modelling worked at no more than 5% anyway, so that won't impact us adversely. And then last bit of good news is that the Household Support Fund will continue for another year at what looks to be the same annual version of what we've been getting every 6 months. So I think, on balance, some good news for us, but it's certainly not going to make our 29 million go away on its own, but some work towards it.
Well, thank you, Katie, for that very detailed and comprehensive run-through. Okay, Councillor Maple.
Thank you very much, and Katie, thank you, as the Chair rightfully says, for a very detailed, comprehensive overview of both the report, but also, importantly, the really important stuff that's happened post the report. I save most of my questions normally for the January session, so people will be pleased to know we'll be going home probably pretty soon. I just wondered whether there had been, obviously what we choose to do as a local authority will be matter for members on the 23rd of February around the council tax rate, but I wondered in particular whether you've heard from others in unitary authorities as to whether they anticipate, and I say unitaries rather than counties, whether they anticipate their particular councils putting the council tax up by 4.994%. Because I know, for example, the BBC seem to indicate that they expect 95% of councils to do so. I recognise that there is a challenge around this. Historically, we've been pretty good around people paying their council tax, even in really challenging, difficult times. Putting it up by another 5% makes that slightly less likely to happen. So there we go. I say all the other stuff I'll say for when we've got more detail and comments from colleagues in January.
Thank you very much. Katie, do you want to comment?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. So obviously we have lots of conversations with our peers across all types of local authority, but I certainly feel that those views that I've had represent the thoughts of accountants, not necessarily administrations, and so I'm not confident to say too much about what I think others will do. But what I will say is that the conversations I've been party to all reflect on the particular challenge, which is if the government is assuming that to fund local authorities moving forward, they're going to do that by allowing flexibility to increase council tax. Where councils don't avail themselves of those flexibilities, they effectively get left behind year after year, and government funding allocations will dwindle as a result. And if any authority is part of a cohort that is outside of the pack, I think they'll suffer. So I think there's some really difficult decisions there. That said, most of my peers are also responsible for the collection of the council tax and for supporting people through benefits and welfare and the council tax reduction scheme. And we aren't quite as hard-hearted as accountants as people might imagine. And we all totally understand the difficulty that making a decision to increase people's bills when they may already be struggling to pay their bills is an incredibly difficult decision, and one that I'm actually quite grateful I'm not part of the cohort of people that will have to make that decision for Medway. I think that's probably all I'll say on that.
Okay, colleagues, well, we will return to this in January, as has been said. So on that basis, I will come to the Vice Chair. We have recommendations in draft form, as it were, at point 14 on page 176. Vice Chair, please.
Thank you, Chair. It is moved that the committee has noted that Cabinet has instructed officer to continue to work with portfolio holder in formulating robust proposal to balance the budget for 2023 and 2024. 14.2, that the committee has commented on the proposal outlined in the draft capital and revenue budget and forwards proposal to the individual overview and scrutiny committees. And for 14.3, that the timetable for consideration by overview and scrutiny is as follows. Business
I think we can probably take that as read.
Yeah, as read.
Okay, that's so moved. Is that seconded? Councillor Clark, thank you. Can I see members in favour of that, please? Okay, thank you, colleagues, very much indeed. If any officers at this stage want to leave the meeting, please feel free to do so. But if you want to stay for the last item, you're equally very welcome. Okay, I see the enthusiasm there. Okay, thank you. This is Steve's item, the next one. Okay, colleagues, thank you so much. So we move on to item 11, which is to consider our work programme, and as said, as usual, Steve will kindly introduce this. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, all I have to add really to the report is to advise members of an additional item to those listed in section 4 of the report, the most recent forward plan. And that is the review of the Council's contract procedure rules, which are going to Audit Committee on the 10th of January, then Cabinet on the 7th of February and Council on the 23rd of February. So if members would like to bear that in mind when considering this report, and I'd welcome comments, please.
So really, it's whether members are happy to allow that process to follow, or would you wish us to look at that as well at the January meeting? Councillor Maple.
Thank you very much. I think, bearing in mind the conversations we've had in closed sessions, both here and at Children's Services, I think that coming to this committee would be helpful. We will take a different perspective than audit. There's some overlap, but there is a different perspective there, so I would welcome that coming. The other thing I would say is, just for advance notice for the next pre-agenda, I'd like to have a conversation around this committee looking at certainly a conversation of some description, bearing in mind DLUC about 4 Secretaries of State ago did a consultation on the issue of online meetings for councils. And just whether we, through the pre-agenda process or through the work programme process or somewhere else, I think we need to politely ask DLUC as to what's going on, because ultimately, if we were given the permission to do that, it would be for this committee to decide and recommend, I suspect, to Cabinet and Council what we would do on that. But until we know what's happening, from a DLUC perspective, it's difficult to do that. So I would suggest initially, perhaps at our next pre-agenda meeting, we can have a conversation about what that might look like.
Okay, I can say a letter has gone on that very point. I think, Steve, can you confirm that?
That's right. I think I forwarded it to members of the committee probably only a few days ago. That Head of Democratic Services sent it on behalf of the portfolio holder to ask for an update.
I'm very grateful for that, and therefore that will wait till we get a response. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Hatwell gave a commitment when he was held to account that he would follow that up, and I've certainly seen that letter that has gone now. Yeah, okay. Fine. So again, if I can just test whether there's whether there is a view with respect, as Councillor Maple has suggested, if members would like that issue, the revised contract, to come back to us at the January meeting. Is there a consensus on that? Yes, I see nods. Okay, so taking that into account, no one else is seeking to speak. I'll come to the Vice Chair for a recommendation, please.
Thank you, Chair. It is moved that members have agreed the committee's work programme at Appendix 1, subject to the inclusion of the revised contract.
Coming back to this committee on the 20th, it's the revised date we agreed. I think it's the 25th of January, 2023, and we need to note the work programme.
Not the work programme of other overview and scrutiny committee at Appendix 2.
Yeah. Is that seconded, please? Councillor Clark? Colleagues, those in favour, please indicate. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that colleagues brings brings the meeting to a close. Can I thank particularly our 2 substitute members for giving up an extra evening to come along this evening. My thanks to all officers who have contributed, particularly to Steve for setting up the meeting and ensuring all the paperwork was done. And finally to Chloe, who has dealt with the live streaming of this meeting. So to all of you, thank you very much for attending. I think it was a very interesting meeting, wide range of questions asked, subjects covered. So thank you all for your contributions, and I will declare at 9:17 the meeting closed. Thank you very much.